"Let's go," Crucifix said, glancing at Sergeant Thunder then backing up. Graceful Raptor and Savage Ghost did the same. Su Qing looked at the sergeant heading toward the wolf pack. The wolves seemed cowed by the explosive spirit power rolling off of him, but Su Qing didn't move. Instead, he stood in place and lifted his iron skewer, which glittered even in the dim light. "Kid, do you know why Sergeant Thunder is in charge?" Crucifix said, even as he flew backward. "It's not just because his cultivation base is in the 6th level of chi condensation. It's because of his sense of judgment and how he takes responsibility in times of crisis." At the same time that Crucifix's words reached Su Qing, a loud rumbling sound echoed out. An arrow from Crucifix's bow had struck a huge tree about 600 meters away, and it toppled to the ground. Savage Ghost and Graceful Raptor also took action to fell one tree after another, creating a wall with only a small opening in it like a gateway. After it was done, Crucifix and Graceful Raptor continued to retreat. Meanwhile, Savage Ghost stood in place in front of the opening, looking like a mountain, his shield in one hand and his wolf tooth club in the other. Up ahead, Sergeant Thunder suddenly exploded into motion, his hands shining radiantly as he lunged toward the wolves. As he moved, he struck out, and each wolf he hit exploded into a cloud of gore. However, there were so many wolves in the pack that Sergeant Thunder soon disappeared within them. The rest of Squad Thunderbolt could only hear the sound of explosions and the cry of the wolves. "Kid," shouted Crucifix, "get back here with us. You'll have your chance to fight soon." Squad Thunderbolt obviously had a battle plan in place, so Su Qing backed up toward Savage Ghost. Savage Ghost grinned at him and hiked his thumb toward the opening in the makeshift wall of trees. Su Qing slipped through, then followed Crucifix and Graceful Raptor. 600 meters past Savage Ghost, he caught up with Graceful Raptor, who had also piled up trees to create a barrier. Right in front of the opening, she'd taken out some more powder, scattered it around, and had just bitten her thumb to draw blood. With the blood, she traced a complex symbol on the ground. Upon sensing Su Qing approaching, she looked at him and gave him a look that said, "Keep going." Su Qing passed her and continued toward Crucifix, who was crouched in a tree another 600 meters away. The tree was huge, giving a great view of the entire area. Looking down as Su Qing approached, Crucifix said, "You're in charge of the area behind me. Fall back 600 meters." Su Qing nodded. By now he realized what Squad Thunderbolt had in mind. After racing past the tree, he ran 600 meters and then looked around. Confirming the area was clear, he found a patch of mud by some bushes, where he went into hiding. This was just like when he would hunt for food in the city ruins. After getting into place, he remained completely motionless. Shortly thereafter, the booming explosions off in the distance grew more intense. Because of all the trees blocking his line of sight, he couldn't see what was happening 2,400 meters away. However, he could sense that there was fierce fighting going on. Just beyond the range of Su Qing's sight, Sergeant Thunder was indeed battling the wolves. Though he was in the 6th level of chi condensation, given that he couldn't waste energy, he wasn't able to do anything extraordinary. Thankfully, he had incredible control over his spirit power. Taking advantage of that, he was now leading the black-scaled wolves towards Savage Ghost. With a nasty grin, Savage Ghost lifted his wolf tooth club overhead. Then Sergeant Thunder zipped past him, and he smashed it down toward the incoming wolves. High in the tree, Crucifix had his bow at the ready. Streams of spirit power in the form of arrows screamed forth, leaving behind streaks in the air as they shot toward the wolves. Howling filled the air again as Sergeant Thunder left Savage Ghost behind and raced toward Graceful Raptor's position. Now, Savage Ghost stood there alone, a living mountain blocking all enemies. It was around this point that Su Qing, from his position hidden in the mud, spotted Sergeant Thunder racing toward him and away from the fighting. Sergeant Thunder passed him at high speed. The old sergeant made eye contact but had no time even to nod. Moments later, he was 600 meters past, where he dropped down cross-legged, pulled out a white bolus and began meditating. There he would remain until it was his turn to fight again. This was Squad Thunderbolt's basic battle strategy. Sergeant Thunder was the strongest among them. He held the enemy off while the others fell back and took up positions. Savage Ghost was the next line of defense. When he grew tired, Graceful Raptor would step up, and behind her was Crucifix. By taking turns holding off the enemy, they could have time to rest and recuperate. That was the ideal way for a small squad to fight in the Forbidden Region, where the mutagen was strong. Of the group, it was Sergeant Thunder and Crucifix who worked the hardest. The former had to fight for the longest, kill the most wolves, and buy the most time for his companions. As for the latter, he not only had to do his best to keep the wolves at bay, but also he had to take advantage of his spot up above to keep the other squad members safe. That said, everyone had an important role to play, and they all had to trust each other and cooperate. So this is what a scavenger squad is like, Su Qing thought, a look of determination growing in his eyes. He remained in place, unmoving for quite a while. Then he saw Savage Ghost retreating from the fight, his chest heaving as he breathed. Not long after that came Graceful Raptor, who looked very pale and had her hands clasped at her chest. Finally, Crucifix passed Su Qing. The man had a grave expression on his face, like usual. However, Su Qing could sense that his spirit power fluctuations were very weak. Behind him was an endless horde of wolves. Crucifix seemed hesitant to leave Su Qing there to fight. "I can handle it," Su Qing said grimly. Crucifix didn't respond. He kept moving and the wolves closed in. An acrid breeze hit Su Qing. Looking out, he saw about a dozen wolves leading the charge, their bodies covered in black scales, their eyes crimson. As they charged toward him, they radiated brutality and madness. Obviously, the initial clash with Squad Thunderbolt had left many of them dead and injured, but the smell of blood had driven the rest of the black-scaled wolves into further levels of ferocity. Apparently, the wolves didn't notice Su Qing at all and were intently focused on Crucifix. However, as they passed, Su Qing's dagger flew out and stabbed into the head of the nearest wolf. The wolf let loose a brief howl of agony before dying. Even as its body fell, Su Qing blurred into motion. His black iron skewer glittered as he stabbed it into the eye of another wolf. Then he clenched his left hand into a fist and launched a blow into a third wolf. That wolf exploded, showering Su Qing with blood. In the briefest of moments, he had killed 3 wolves. He was as nimble and deadly as a Rakshasa as he dashed through the wolf pack, his eyes cold and his attacks decisive. One black-scaled wolf after another fell to his iron skewer, filling the area with agonized shrieks. Soon, he was soaked in sticky blood, but he kept his grip on his skewer, which was now red instead of black. And yet the wolves were so numerous that, before long, some of their attacks made it past his defenses. One by one, fang and claw wounds built up on him. Thankfully, he managed to avoid most of the attacks. What was more, the regenerative powers provided by the violet crystal also worked wonders. Flesh wounds would heal up in a matter of a few breaths of time, and even the more serious wounds would at least stop bleeding rather quickly. That said, he was so splattered with wolf blood that it wasn't possible for the other squad members to see what was happening. Because of his terrifying ability to heal himself, he was able to keep fighting far longer than anyone thought possible. Wolf corpses piled up, and Su Qing's eyes grew colder. Eventually, he had held his ground longer than any of the other squad members, to the point that the wolf pack now seemed wary of him. From a distance, the faint bits of light that pierced through the canopy fell on his blood-splattered form, making him look even more terrifying. 600 meters behind him was Sergeant Thunder, and high in the trees above. Both men were completely shocked at Su Qing's level of ferocity and his ability to stand and fight. "Kid, get back," Sergeant Thunder finally yelled. Su Qing still wasn't tired, but he could sense that he was getting dangerously low on spirit power. The violet crystal could restore his body and heal his wounds, but it couldn't make up for lost spirit power. Thankfully, he practiced body refinement, so unlike Graceful Raptor, being low on spirit power didn't mean he couldn't fight. But it still affected him. He had to breathe, and that meant commingling mutagen with his spirit power, and the mutation blotches on his arm throbbed more than ever. Therefore, when he heard Sergeant Thunder's command, he unhesitatingly fell back. Just as he started moving, a wolf lunged toward him that, unlike the others, had black eyes instead of red. Su Qing's iron skewer became a streak of red as he thrust it into the wolf's head, then prepared to keep falling back. However, that was when the wolf corpse's shadow suddenly twisted and distorted. Su Qing wasn't sure if he was seeing things. Given the dappled sunlight in the area, it was possible, but it seemed like the shadow was moving toward him. The sunlight was dim and scattered, making it impossible to see exactly what was happening, and before he could determine for sure, the shadow touched him. A tremor passed through him, and he felt an unspeakable evil suddenly fill him from head to toe. Before anything else could happen, though, the evil reached his chest, and the violet crystal there that, up to this point, had done nothing else other than heal Su Qing. In that instant, he trembled again as an icy flow erupted within him. A moment later, that sense of encroaching evil vanished. The icy flow quickly ceased. In the blink of an eye, it was like it had never existed, and the violet crystal went back to normal. Su Qing stared down at himself in shock. However, now was not the time to ponder the situation. Body healing, he flew backward, wondering if Sergeant Thunder or Crucifix were aware of what had just happened. As Su Qing fell back, Sergeant Thunder strode forward, a surprised expression on his face. "Good job. Now get back there and rest up. Black-scaled wolves live in the depths of the forbidden region where the mutagen is strong. They hate places such as this, where the mutagen is weaker. All we have to do is hold out for long enough, and they'll eventually just back down." With that, Sergeant Thunder continued forward, surging with spirit power as he attacked the wolves Su Qing had just disengaged from. Savage Ghost appeared. He had been waiting further back for a while now, and seeing Su Qing covered in blood as he left behind the piles of wolf corpses, reached out with an arm of support. "I'm fine," Su Qing said, brushing his arm away and continuing away from the front line. Savage Ghost watched him go, a look of respect in his eyes. When Su Qing reached Graceful Raptor, it was obvious she'd been told about his fighting, but she still seemed shocked by his appearance. A moment later, she produced a leather pouch which she handed to him. He accepted it and could feel from the shape that it contained medicinal pills. Thanking Graceful Raptor, he continued past her until he spotted Crucifix high up in a tree. Crucifix didn't say anything, but he gave Su Qing a nod of approval. Su Qing returned the nod silently. Finally, he found a spot in the very back where he expelled a breath full of impure vital energy, then took out 3 white boluses. As the pills did their work, he started absorbing spirit power to replenish himself. About an hour later, he opened his eyes. He was no longer exhausted. Furthermore, he was surprised to find that the mutagen within him seemed negligible. Then he pulled up his sleeve and looked at his left arm, and to his shock, he found that one of the mutation blotches was gone. However, he was still clearly in the second level of body refinement. He hadn't weakened at all from the fierce fighting, and after recovering, he even found that he had made some progress. He clearly remembered that, while fighting, he had been forced to absorb some surrounding spirit power, and had felt the 2 mutation blotches on his arm throbbing. He had consumed white boluses before, but they had never been this effective. Yet there was no other explanation for what had just happened to him, other than that coldness which had flowed through him, thanks to the violet crystal. That shadow felt vile, then the crystal sent that coldness out. His eyes narrowed as he thought back to the gruish scene from earlier. He was absolutely certain that he had seen that shadow moving, and that it hadn't been a trick of the light. And the stream of coldness from the violet crystal had also been real. It was like it had fought back against the encroachment of evil and had sucked it inside. Did it consume it? All he had now were suspicions and speculations. Deathblade's thoughts. Many thanks to VKid, Justna, Apujanata, and Ryu980 for the reviews. Reviews help a lot, so if you're enjoying the story and inclined to do so, please leave a review. I won't bug y'all about them all the time. Just every once in a while, grinning face with big eyes. What exactly is this violet crystal? And what was that evil encroaching shadow? Does it have anything to do with my mutation blotch disappearing? Su Qing really couldn't wrap his mind around it. As he sat thinking about it, the other members of Squad Thunderbolt began to pass him by. Eventually, he calmed his thoughts, though his eyes continued to glitter brightly. The answers to his questions didn't matter right now. He was now rested, and it was his turn to fight again. He stood and wiped off his iron skewer. Then Crucifix fell back, and he jumped into the action. With incredible speed, he bore down on the wolf pack. Agonized shrieks rang out like a horrifying symphony. He had survived the opening of the god's eyes and the blood rain, and this twilight battle was like a grindstone honing him into something even sharper than before. He fought even longer this time. Then he fell back and the rest of the squad took their turns. Time passed. The sun set and the moon rose. In the dark night of the forbidden region, the deadly sounds of battle continued to ring out. Until everyone was exhausted and the white boluses had all been consumed. They had so much mutagen building up within them that they were reaching the point of mutation. That was when dawn came. The last of the exhausted black-scaled wolves looked at them, then turned tail and vanished. Everything went quiet. Every member of Squad Thunderbolt was splattered with blood as they lay on the ground gasping for breath. Su Qing was no exception. The violet crystal healed his wounds, but he was so mentally drained that he felt as exhausted as everyone else. "We finally made it out alive," Graceful Raptor whispered, Struggling to her feet, she looked at Su Qing. "Thank you." Savage Ghost, despite huffing for air, looked at Su Qing and gave him a big thumbs up. Su Qing's performance in the night of fighting surpassed anything Sergeant Thunder or Crucifix could have expected. In fact, without him, the wolf pack probably wouldn't have retreated, and Squad Thunderbolt might have experienced mutation. Only Su Qing, who lay there staring up at the sky, was full of doubts. During the fighting, it had become very obvious to him that his rate of mutagen absorption was much slower than before. In fact, he even got the sense that the mutagen inside of him was slowly fading away. As everyone lay there, Sergeant Thunder rubbed his forehead, then looked at the group and said, "This wasn't a coincidence. The black-scaled wolves just kept coming and coming, almost like they were after something in particular. We need to take out all of our belongings and inspect them. I have a feeling this was the work of human hands." The other members looked doubtful, but they did as the sergeant ordered and took out all of their belongings. Su Qing's heart pounded as he considered whether something in Horsfur's bag might be the reason for the wolf attack. However, that was when Graceful Raptor made a sudden cry of shock and pointed at Savage Ghost. Among his belongings was a tattered wooden box. Shockingly, the box seemed to be slowly disintegrating, to the point where wisps of smoke rose up from it. Because of the complex mixture of aromas in the jungle of the Forbidden Region, the smell was easy to miss. "Why is it disintegrating?" Savage Ghost asked, sounding puzzled. Sergeant Thunder walked over, took the box, and handed it to Graceful Raptor. After sniffing it, an unsightly expression overtook her face, and she nodded. "Where did you get it?" Sergeant Thunder asked. Scratching his head, Savage Ghost said, "I bought it the day I got back to camp. It's an insect-repelling powder." "It's made from butterfly rabbit droppings," Graceful Raptor explained. "When exposed to the right stimulant, they'll ignite and attract scaled creatures. And of course, black-scaled wolves are scaled creatures." Savage Ghost froze. The atmosphere suddenly became very tense. Su Qing's eyes narrowed as he considered the implication. A long moment passed, and then Sergeant Thunder shook his head. "Savage Ghost got tricked. If we're talking about someone in the camp setting a trap for us, it's easy to imagine who it is." "Squad Bloodshadow," Crucifix said coldly. "I'd imagine they'll have a follow-up move," Graceful Raptor said, "and we're in bad shape right now." Looking off into the distance, Sergeant Thunder said, "Then the question is whether we proceed with the mission or give up. What does everyone think?" Su Qing kept his mouth shut. The others exchanged glances, but it was Crucifix who finally said, "Sarge, we're not very far from the harvesting point. We've wasted a lot of resources on this trip. If we go back empty-handed..." Sergeant Thunder didn't say anything immediately. He looked at Savage Ghost and Graceful Raptor. The former had his head bowed in shame, and the latter had a defiant tilt to her jaw. Sergeant Thunder sighed. "We keep going," he said. "Once we reach the harvesting point, we need to hurry up with the harvest. Then we split up and take different routes back. We'll reconvene in the camp." The decision having been made, they took a short time to rest, then started moving through the Forbidden Region again. Along the way, Su Qing approached Graceful Raptor and asked her about the piece of amber he acquired from Fat Mountain. She couldn't hide her shock as she took the amber and looked at it closely. "It's the tail of a ghost-faced scorpion," she said. "Its venom is powerful, and it has positive medicinal properties that can release latent power hidden within the body. However, the venom is dangerous and has to be neutralized quickly after use. Nevertheless, many people raise ghost-faced scorpions because of those reasons, plus the price they fetch on the market." Su Qing thanked Graceful Raptor and put the piece of amber away. The group kept on high alert, but at the same time moved ahead quickly. This time they kept even quieter than before. Perhaps because of the incident with black-scaled wolves, there didn't seem to be any other beasts in the area. The squad met no dangers, and soon reached a border area that marked the interior of the Forbidden Region depths. The terrain was no longer just pure jungle. Now there were rolling hills and flowing streams. Of course, the water in the streams was black and not viable for human consumption. A path led through the thickest part of the jungle, at the end of which was a beautiful canyon. Upon entering the canyon, Su Qing felt like he was in another world. Thick vines grew overhead like a ceiling, blocking out most of the sunlight. However, there were no trees in the canyon, only flowering plants. The flowers were roughly the size of a fist and were all sorts of colors. The stalks, which emanated a bluish glow, had 7 leaves. They looked like glittering stars and together made it seem like the glade itself was a peaceful starry sky. It was incredibly beautiful. This was the harvesting point Squad Thunderbolt had discovered in the past. It was a secret location that allowed the squad to live comfortably by profiting off what they could harvest there. There was a special way to harvest the plants, so in order to save time and avoid damaging the product, Su Qing didn't participate. After observing for a bit, he settled down off to the side to do some breathing exercises. Because of the previous day's battle, his cultivation base had improved, and he was nearing a breakthrough point. In order to give himself the greatest chance of surviving future dangers, Su Qing wasn't going to waste any time. Even in the Forbidden region, he continued working on his sea and mountain incantation and absorbed spirit power from the surroundings. As the spirit power poured into him, a wind picked up in the glade. Sergeant Thunder looked over but didn't do anything to stop him. After all, he knew full well that they might be attacked on their way back. Right now, even a slight bit of extra power might be enough to guarantee their survival. Some time passed, and Squad Thunderbolt was still harvesting plants. That was when popping and cracking sounds rang out inside Su Qing. Filth oozed out of his pores, mingling with the wolf blood that still coated him. At the same time, Su Qing's flesh and blood began to ravenously devour the surrounding spirit power. The sounds within him grew louder, then suddenly stopped, whereupon his mind filled with rumbling sounds. All the blood vessels in his body swelled, and his flesh filled with astonishing levels of spirit power. A penetrating aura slowly filled him as the spirit power fluctuations around him faded. He had reached the third level of the sea and mountain incantation. Before opening his eyes, he bowed his head. As a result, no one could see the violet glimmer in his eyes. Truth be told, there was no joy in his eyes. Rather, he had deep misgivings. And that was because, when looking down, he saw something happening with his shadow. His session of cultivation just now had felt off. After absorbing the surrounding spirit power, he used the sea and mountain incantation to separate the mutagen and then send it throughout his body. But the mutagen did not go into the mutation blotch on his arm. Instead, it flowed into his own shadow. It was like his shadow was consuming the mutagen. After some thought, Su Qing suppressed his misgivings and looked up. After first looking at Squad Thunderbolt going about their harvesting work, he turned his attention to the entrance of the glade and the jungle beyond. Just barely he could see some structures off in the distance. It looked like a temple complex, sinking away into time, pulsing with an ancient aura. Sergeant Thunder followed his line of sight and realized what he was looking at. Nobody knows when that place was built. It marks the most distant boundary we scavengers can go to. In other words, you can't go past it. If you're in danger, it's a good place to hide out. Boundary, huh? Su Qing said. Plucking a 7-leaf clover and putting it into his bag, Sergeant Thunder continued. Yeah, people say that, back in those days, this particular forbidden region was formed because the eyes of the god above opened and looked upon those temples. Scavengers have explored the place, and nobody ever found anything. There's nothing inside other than some special crystals. What do you mean special? Su Qing asked, curious. Crush those crystals into dust and rub the resulting powder onto a scar and it'll disappear, completely without a trace. To scavengers, they're basically useless. He glanced at Crucifix, but sometimes important people come asking for them. At this point, Crucifix, Savage Ghost, and Graceful Raptor finished collecting the plants. After handing their portions to Sergeant Thunder, he split the collection up into 5 parts, handing 1 part to Su Qing. This is yours, and now we split up. That will increase our chances of getting back safely. He pulled out a map and handed it to Su Qing. I've got big plans, kid, he said. That's why Squad Bloodshadow is after me. Furthermore, I'm in charge, so I need to be the distraction. You get back to camp as fast as you can. Wait for me there. Su Qing wanted to say something to him, but before he could, Sergeant Thunder slipped out of the glade and vanished. Crucifix clasped Su Qing's shoulder briefly, then also left. Savage Ghost and Graceful Raptor both gave some further words of advice to Su Qing, then disappeared. He watched them go. Then he put the 7-leaf clovers away and took a final look at that temple complex. A moment later, he took a deep breath and headed out of the glade. Now that he was in the 3rd level of body refinement, he was much faster than before. He moved through the jungle as nimbly as a monkey, moving non-stop through the trees. He didn't follow the same path they'd taken to the glade. Instead, he used the map to find a more circuitous route. Using the techniques he'd learned along the way, he avoided danger as much as possible. He did run into a few mutant beasts, but he took care of them without any trouble. Occasionally, he would spot his shadow, and remained convinced that it seemed strange. And now he knew with certainty that whenever he absorbed mutagen, whether it was from spirit power or just by breathing, it would end up in his shadow. And tracing the timeline back, he knew that it started with the flow of coldness that emerged from the violet crystal. It had all become very obvious after he reached the third level of the sea and mountain incantation. After the violet crystal engulfed the shadow of the black-scaled wolf, his own shadow had transformed. He narrowed his eyes at how ghoulish it seemed. Rolling up his sleeve yet again, he confirmed that he only had one mutation blotch on his arm. What was more, that single mark was faint, to the point where he almost couldn't make it out. If things kept going in this manner, then the mutagen within him would become weaker and weaker, until he was completely cleansed. Based on what he'd read in the sea and mountain incantation bamboo slip, that level of perfect purity was something only seen in elite humans in the revered ancient mainland. Is it all the doing of the violet crystal? Stopping for a moment on the branch of a huge tree, he stared up into the sky and rubbed the spot on his chest where the crystal was. Then he forced aside his misgivings and started moving through the jungle again. Maybe mutagen wasn't a threat to him for now, but there were still plenty of dangers to deal with in the forbidden region. In fact, he had just spotted 2 mutant bears that were even stronger than Sergeant Thunder. Shockingly, on the back of each bear was a huge, colorful spider. Countless strands of spider silk stretched from the spiders and into the bodies of the bears, apparently allowing the spiders to control them. The bears careened about, completely unable to control themselves. They smashed trees and even crushed other mutant beasts as they ran along. If it wasn't for the fact that they were chasing some sort of red tiger, and thus didn't notice Xianxia, he would have been in big trouble. The forbidden region was full of things like this. About 2 hours later, Xianxia found himself at the top of a tree, carefully examining his surroundings. Off in the distance, he had spotted something that didn't seem like it belonged in a jungle. It was a massive, mountain-sized jellyfish, emanating frigid coldness. It glowed faintly as it floated high in the air above the forbidden region. Because its body was translucent, it was possible to see countless rotting beast corpses inside it. It had a host of tentacles dangling beneath it, all of them covered with ghoulish eyes. However, most of the eyes were closed. As it drifted along slowly, the jungle beneath it was overwhelmed with intense cold. Its aura was strong, far beyond Xianxia's level of strength. In fact, he was fairly certain that the bears he'd just encountered were weaker. Even looking at the thing from a distance, he felt stiff and cold and could sense how dangerous it was. Only when the giant jellyfish disappeared in the distance did he breathe a sigh of relief. It had left behind a streak of frozen land in the jungle that was clearly visible from where he was. If that thing had come in this direction, he gulped. There was danger everywhere in this jungle, but because of how his shadow absorbed mutagen, he had an advantage in that he could stay inside this place longer. As he grew stronger, he had the feeling that advantage would grow greater. After resting for a moment, he continued with more vigilance than ever. Time passed, and eventually the sun set, leaving behind only an evening glow. As howling echoed out in the jungle, Xianxia checked his map. Based on his estimations, if he kept running through the night, he would make it out of the forbidden region by daybreak. As he contemplated the matter, he heard a boom off in the distance, followed by a blood-curdling scream, and the voice sounded familiar. Savage Ghost. His eyes turned sharp. Without any hesitation, he approached the source of the noise, moving stealthily through the vegetation. Before long, he reached the point where the sound came from. Hiding at the top of a tree, he found himself looking down at 6 or 7 corpses, and one of them was Savage Ghost. His skin was greenish-black, making it obvious he had mutated. At the same time, he had been decapitated and his body was mutilated. His huge steel shield had been broken in 2, creating one large chunk of metal and one small chunk. As for his wolf tooth club, it lay off to the side, covered in blood. Obviously, Savage Ghost had, in the midst of his mutation, taken his enemies out with him. Xianxia looked at the scene reticently, sorrow rising up in his heart when he suddenly noticed something else. Some distance away, surrounded by 5 enemies, his body turning green as he hovered on the brink of mutation, was Sergeant Thunder. When Xianxia saw that, his pupils constricted. Then he tightened his hand around his iron skewer, his killing intent surging. Looking around, Xianxia realized that Sergeant Thunder was surrounded by Squad Bloodshadow. The sun was setting, replacing daytime with the darkness of night. It wouldn't be long before everything around them was pitch black. Sinister coldness proliferated, filling the area. The sun was like a dying old man who refused to breathe his last. It struggled to illuminate the area and was barely able to penetrate the thick, leafy canopy. Hidden at the top of the tree, Su Qing was different. He looked down coldly, taking in the entire tableau. There were 5 members of Squad Bloodshadow present. 2 of them were fighting Sergeant Thunder, while the other 3 blocked off any possible avenues of escape. The latter group seemed about as strong as Graceful Raptor. They were in the 3rd level. They didn't dare to get too close to the actual fighting, and thus hovered on the periphery. That said, their mere presence was enough to keep Sergeant Thunder slightly distracted. The 2 who were fighting, one had spirit power fluctuations only slightly weaker than Sergeant Thunder. He was in the 6th level of chi condensation, and he was also an old man. His hair was disheveled and he had wild eyes. His clothes were tattered, revealing rippling muscles underneath. He was Captain Bloodshadow, leader of Squad Bloodshadow, and the same man who had feasted on Graceful Raptor's dog. Licking his lips, Captain Bloodshadow launched attacks with lightning speed as he glared at Sergeant Thunder, whose skin was slowly turning more and more green. "Squad Thunderbolt is going to be expunged from the listings in the base camp," said the captain. "Why don't you just kill yourself, Sergeant Thunder? That would be better than mutating like Savage Ghost did. At least you'll have a normal corpse left behind. Hey, if you just commit suicide, I'll make sure to take care of the rest of your squad." After the captain finished speaking, the other fighter chimed in. "That's right. Don't worry, Sergeant Thunder. After you die, we'll take good care of Squad Thunderbolt. I've been wanting to see what Graceful Raptor tastes like, and that kid you took in would make us a lot of money as a living treasure." This other person was a middle-aged man who was nothing short of ugly. He had a deformed hunchback and only one good eye. The other eye was nothing but a mass of scar tissue. His spirit power fluctuations didn't reach the same level as his captain's. That said, he was stronger than Crucifix. In other words, he was at the 5th level of chi condensation. However, his cultivation base didn't seem completely stable, indicating he'd only recently made a breakthrough. Both of Sergeant Thunder's opponents were trying to get him riled up, but the sergeant's face remained expressionless, and he had death in his eyes as he attacked with renewed vigor. The 2 members of Bloodshadow obviously didn't want to kill Sergeant Thunder at the price of being seriously injured in the process, so they were keeping their distance. Meanwhile, Sergeant Thunder was obviously intent on taking out his opponents, even if he died in the process. Killing intent swirled in Su Qing's eyes. 1 in the 6th level, 1 in the 5th level, 3 in the 3rd level. The truth was that he could just leave, but he valued gratitude and Sergeant Thunder had treated him well, so he wasn't going to leave. Instead, he took another look around the area. There wasn't a lot of room to fight as the trees were thick here, and the deepening darkness meant that there were ample places to strike from the shadows. Having made a decision, he crouched on the tree branch, his eyes burning with murderous intention. Then he jumped, tapping into all his strength to shoot down like an arrow released from the 3rd level of the sea and mountain incantation, combined with the power of the violet crystal, making his fleshly body incredibly strong. He moved with such speed that he left a string of afterimages behind him. The people below had no idea what was coming. In the blink of an eye, Su Qing was on the field of battle. He appeared first next to a skinny youth who was watching Sergeant Thunder through narrowed eyes and completely unaware of Su Qing's presence. However, when the wind brought by Su Qing hit him, he looked over in surprise, and then an iron skewer pierced his temple with terrifying force. Before the body fell, Su Qing was on the move again. Bending at the waist, he launched himself with cheetah-like speed toward the next person in his line of sight. The second scavenger saw him coming. The man's pupils constricted, and he tried to jump away. But Su Qing was too quick, arriving with a fistful of shocking power from the sea and mountain incantation. The punch landed on the man's chest, caving it in and causing blood to spray everywhere. In fact, an explosion of blood emerged from his back, along with the sound of shattering bones. At the same time, Su Qing's left hand swept through the air, sending his dagger flying with terrifying speed toward the 3rd scavenger. When the second man's chest and back exploded, it alerted the 3rd man. However, despite being on guard, all he saw was a blur, along with a blast of wind that hit his face. Eyes wide, he used his last remaining bits of energy to reach up to his forehead, which was when he felt the cold dagger protruding from his face. The force of the dagger had crushed the bones, caving in the top of his face. All of these things happened in the time it takes a spark to fly off of a piece of flint. Su Qing was moving so fast and acting so decisively that the 1st and 3rd corpses dropped to the ground at the same time. A moment later, the man whose torso he'd crushed fell backward. The toppling corpse revealed Su Qing to the others on the battlefield. His long hair covered half of his face, and his glaring eyes made him seem like a wolf. Sergeant Thunder and the two Bloodshadow members were all looking at him in surprise. The wind seemed to go still. Suddenly, the death in Sergeant Thunder's eyes was drowned out by a ripple of light as his eyes focused on Su Qing. "Get out of here, kid." Su Qing ignored him and instead focused on Captain Bloodshadow, who looked past him at the three bodies, his cheek twitching. He had to admit that he had made some errors in assessing Sergeant Thunder's sense of judgment. The first mistake was not realizing that Savage Ghost didn't fear death. The second mistake was underestimating the kid. "Kill him?" Captain Bloodshadow said with a cold snort. As of this moment, he decided that this fight needed to end even if he got seriously injured in the process. Energy surged from within him as he made a fist and launched a blow at Sergeant Thunder. The middle-aged man in the 5th level of Qi condensation grinned viciously as he turned in Su Qing's direction. Spirit power surged as he walked forward and simultaneously cracked his knuckles. He knew that this young man he faced was very quick on his feet, and he had just killed 3 enemies in the blink of an eye, but the man was still completely confident. Given that he just recently achieved a 5th level cultivation base, he was certain he could kill this opponent with ease. Su Qing stared at him with eyes even colder than before. Based on his experience, he was confident that he could kill someone in the 4th level of Qi condensation. As for someone in the 5th level, he wasn't sure he could come out on top. But there was only one way to find out. He burst into motion, tapping into all the speed he could muster as he launched a fist at the middle-aged man. The cultivator watched him come, a disdainful smile on his face. Almost as soon as Su Qing started moving, the middle-aged cultivator released a stream of spirit power fluctuations, which formed an invisible barrier in front of him. Su Qing's fist crashed into the barrier. A boom rippled out, and cracks spread out across the barrier. However, it didn't collapse, and there was even a powerful backlash that swept through Su Qing, causing a crack to ring out from his wrist as it was dislocated. Su Qing's eyes narrowed as he violently shook his right arm to force the wrist bones back into place. Then, vicious light shone in his eyes as, instead of backing up, he launched another blow. Another boom rang out and more cracks spread across the barrier. Then it collapsed. At the same time, a violent blast erupted from the other side of the barrier, causing dirt to spray everywhere as it enveloped Su Qing. The shattered remnants of the barrier seemed to form countless invisible blades that slashed numerous bloody wounds onto Su Qing. He was sent staggering backward, blood spraying everywhere. The wrist he had just fixed was now dislocated again, and his arm hung limply at his side. As dirt rained down around them, the middle-aged cultivator looked at Su Qing scornfully and said, "Moron, you think a measly body cultivator can do a thing against someone who cultivates magic? That's not to mention I'm 3 levels higher than you. You've bitten off a bit more than you can chew." In reality, he was astonished. Never could he have imagined that his spirit power barrier would collapse after only 2 blows. It was a good thing he'd recently reached the 5th level, allowing him to unleash the follow-up attack after the barrier collapsed. Otherwise, he could tell his opponent would have fallen upon him in fury. Su Qing stood there with his brow furrowed as pain rippled through him, especially from his arm. Glaring at his opponent, he once again violently snapped his arm out to relocate the wrist. When his opponent saw the brutal way Su Qing treated himself, the man stopped in place with wide eyes. Then he put his hands together, performed an incantation gesture, and waved his finger in Su Qing's direction. The spirit power around him converged, transforming into a head-sized fireball that rushed toward Su Qing. The fireball moved with shocking force, causing the air around it to ripple and distort from the heat. As it neared, Su Qing dodged to the side, yet the fireball followed him. Killing intent flickered in the middle-aged cultivator's eyes. Not bothering with another spirit power barrier, he performed another incantation gesture, sending a second fireball after Su Qing, then a third. Su Qing could tell that the 3 fireballs were going to be impossible to escape. Seeing that he was right next to one of the bodies he'd just slain, he grabbed it and threw it at the nearest incoming fireball. A whoop rang out as the fireball hit the corpse, setting it ablaze. In only 3 breaths of time, the corpse had been transformed into ash. That alone gave Su Qing a clear understanding of how dangerous the fireballs were. Even just the heat radiating off of them made his skin feel like it was burning, and before he could jump out of the way, the second and third fireballs closed in. Then, The cultivator's eyes turned scornful as he unexpectedly detonated the fireballs. Rumble! Flames exploded everywhere, creating a stupefying level of deadly heat. It was impossible for Su Qing to fully avoid the attack. He was fast enough that he managed to stay out of the way of the main blast. Even still, the heat caused blisters to break out all over his body, and his internal organs felt like they were being cooked. "Hurry up, Flamecrow," shouted Captain Bloodshadow. "I know, Captain. There's no way this wolf pup can handle 2 more of my fireballs without becoming a corpse." Flamecrow grinned as he looked at Su Qing. Eyes burning with brutality, he extended his right hand and he summoned 2 more fireballs and sent them flying. Fearing Su Qing might dodge out of the way, he did the same thing as before, making sure to cut off all possible routes of escape. The intense heat burned the ground and turned the trees into ash. Without the leaf canopy to block out the evening sun, brightness suddenly flooded the area, making it impossible for Flamecrow to clearly see the aftermath of his attack. However, he was absolutely confident that, backed by the 5th level of his cultivation base, the fireballs would wipe out anyone in the 3rd level or lower. Panting a bit, he brushed off his hands arrogantly and turned to the fight between Sergeant Thunder and Captain Bloodshadow. "Hey, Sergeant Thunder," he said, "your people are worthless." He laughed coldly as he walked back to join the fight. However, he didn't have a chance to see any despair on Sergeant Thunder's face. All he saw was his captain's expression transform into one of shock. Flamecrow reacted quickly and dodged to the side. But he wasn't fast enough. A scrawny form burst toward him with 2 fists that slammed into his spirit power barrier. The barrier shattered, and Su Qing was forced backward by the backlash. However, a dagger and an iron skewer appeared in his hands, and he hurled them out. Because the barrier provided a modicum of resistance, the dagger slowed down enough that Flamecrow managed to avoid it. Even still, it sliced through his ear, sending blood splattering out. As for the iron skewer, it stabbed right into his chest. Blood sprayed out of his mouth. However, the injury apparently didn't hit any vital spot and wasn't enough to kill him. Pain fueled the fury in Flamecrow's eyes as he shouted in rage, then looked over his shoulder. Kneeling in the flames only about 20 meters away was the bedraggled Su Qing. He was still covered in blisters and burns, but in the evening sun, his eyes were as cold as ice and raged with killing intent. Deathblade's thoughts. Thanks so much to Tao of Cheese, Gizra, and Ludicrous Taoist for the reviews. Very much appreciated. Folded hands. The sight of Su Qing illuminated by the evening sun was a complete shock to Flamecrow. He was a veteran scavenger, but if he was some other person, even someone with a superior cultivation base, he would have been astonished into immobility by this turn of events. However, despite the surprise that shook him to the core, the deadly rage he felt caused his eye to burn with killing intent. "Okay, you little wolf pup, I'm going to rip out your teeth one by one and keep them as trophies." With that, he tore off his damaged shirt, revealing his wizened torso. Not paying attention to the chunk that had been sliced off his ear, he performed a double-handed incantation gesture to summon a fireball far larger than any of the previous ones. Su Qing's pupils constricted, then he burst into motion. "Release!" howled Flamecrow, and he threw his hands out, causing the massive fireball to split into 5 parts. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the fireball spread out and then bore down on Su Qing. However, Su Qing simply went on the attack, going for the spirit power barrier with 2 fists. The incoming fireballs burned him and shoved him back, but his momentum kept him going forward, and thus he and Flamecrow started fighting fiercely in the jungle. As the battle grew more and more intense, it became sadly obvious that Su Qing was simply not on the same level as his opponent. The spirit power barrier and the fireballs made it extremely difficult to get close enough to land blows. At the same time, they posed a dangerous threat. Su Qing's advantages were his spectacular powers of regeneration, allowing him to rapidly heal his wounds without any negative effect on his battle prowess. His body was strong, and though the endless pain had an effect on his psyche, he had grown up in the slums and had mental fortitude that surpassed ordinary people. Most importantly, the strong mutagen in the surrounding spirit power didn't have any effect on him. It was a different story for Flamecrow, though. The wound to his ear wasn't worth worrying about, but his chest injury was getting worse. And then there was his spirit power. His cultivation base was in the 5th level of chi condensation, but he couldn't just burn through power endlessly. He had to absorb spirit power from around him to keep going. And Su Qing was putting a lot of pressure on him, making it impossible for him to have any time to rest. As a result, mutagen was building up within him. Soon, Flamecrow went from being angry to being nervous, and then anxiety became plainly visible on his face. Things were going wrong within him with the mutagen building up, and at the same time, there was obviously something very strange going on in the person he was fighting. Ordinarily speaking, a third-level opponent like this couldn't possibly take so many hits from fireballs. In fact, even a fifth-level opponent would have been killed by now. Not even Flamecrow himself could survive a situation like this. Though the young man in front of him was heavily wounded, from the very beginning of the fight, he hadn't lost an ounce of speed or power. Flamecrow was feeling increasingly unsettled. The mutagen within him continued to grow, and as he got closer and closer to the point of mutation, he started to get incredibly anxious. Captain Bloodshadow was still fighting Sergeant Thunder, but at the same time kept an eye on the other fight. At a certain point, he angrily shouted, "Flamecrow, you piece of trash, hurry up and beat him." He was inclined to help, but Sergeant Thunder was going all out to prevent him from doing so. Sergeant Thunder, it was obvious that Su Qing was trying to force Flamecrow into mutation. He wasn't sure where Su Qing got his confidence from, or how he managed to keep fighting considering the pain he was obviously in. But everyone had their secrets. Sergeant Thunder knew that well, for he was the same. Instead of wondering about the details, he did everything he could to prevent Captain Bloodshadow from helping his comrade. The fighting continued. The increasingly frustrated Flamecrow launched 3 more fireballs, all the while being peppered with curses from his captain. With every moment that passed, his apprehension grew until it turned into pure madness within him. All of a sudden, he smacked himself in the chest with his own palm, causing himself to cough up a massive mouthful of blood. Before the blood could drop to the ground, he reached out and grabbed it. Then he started muttering an enchantment that turned the blood black. Su Qing's pupils constricted, and he felt a sense of intense crisis building up within him. Lunging forward, he attempted to interrupt whatever magic his opponent was trying to unleash. Unfortunately, Flamecrow launched the magical technique with incredible speed. Su Qing had just started moving when Flamecrow looked up, his expression twisted and distorted with brutality as he waved his right hand out in front of him. The black blood therein expanded rapidly into a head-sized blood sphere. The sphere bubbled, surging with shocking power as it shot in Su Qing's direction. "Time to die," Flamecrow howled. He was visibly drained after launching the technique, and as mutagen surged within him, his legs trembled weakly. Meanwhile, killing intent raged in Su Qing's eyes. Sergeant Thunder had guessed correctly that Su Qing was trying to force Flamecrow into mutation. However, there was one thing that Sergeant Thunder didn't realize. Su Qing had never given up on the idea of trying to kill his opponent before that happened. He no longer held his dagger or his iron skewer, yet he was still looking for an opportunity to strike a fatal blow. Upon seeing Flamecrow sag limply, he knew his opportunity had arrived. The instant the blood sphere appeared, Su Qing pushed himself forward with even greater speed. However, he didn't move in a straight line toward his opponent. He shifted slightly to the side, allowing him to pass Savage Ghost's corpse. The corpse was charred and burned thanks to the fireball attacks. However, it was still there, and next to it was Savage Ghost's equipment, his wolf tooth club, and the 2 pieces of his steel shield. Su Qing was specifically aiming for the larger piece of his shield. As he sped by, he reached down and picked it up. Using it to cover his skinny frame, he raced onward toward the black blood sphere and Flamecrow. A huge boom rang out when the blood sphere hit Su Qing, or more specifically, the shield. Countless drops of blood exploded out. In the blink of an eye, the shield shattered into 5 pieces. Nevertheless, it still absorbed the majority of the force in the attack. Su Qing was hit by some of the black blood, but not enough to be fatal. Gritting his teeth, he kept moving, becoming a streak of afterimages that closed in relentlessly on Flamecrow. A mocking gleam appeared in Flamecrow's eyes, and he didn't even bother to evade the incoming attack. His hands flashed in a double-handed incantation gesture, causing the countless drops of black blood behind Su Qing to rise into the air, then turn into arrow-like streaks that shot toward him. Su Qing's escape route had been cut off, but he was never planning to retreat in the first place. All that did was ensure that Su Qing didn't even have the option of retreating. Closing in, he clenched his left hand into a fist, and yet it was his right hand that actually delivered a punch. Rumble! Cracks exploded out onto the surface of the spirit power barrier protecting Flamecrow. Blood sprayed left and right from Su Qing's right fist. However, It was also possible to see something scaly in the mangled flesh in his hand. Before Flamecrow could see exactly what was happening, Su Qing unleashed a second fist strike. The barrier shattered, lashing Su Qing with a backlash, forcing him away and making it impossible for him to advance. The mockery in Flamecrow's eyes grew stronger. However, seemingly out of nowhere, Su Qing managed to unleash a scrap of additional power. Unlike before, he didn't actually back up because of the backlash from the shattered barrier. Forcing himself to move again, he reached out with his right hand and viciously grabbed Flamecrow in the chest, exactly where the iron skewer had stabbed him earlier. Apparently, Su Qing's last scrap of energy only allowed him to do this one thing. Instead of landing a fatal blow, all he managed to do was open up Flamecrow's wound a bit more, then fall back. Flamecrow's face flickered in surprise, and he shoved himself away from Su Qing. However, when he realized that this move of Su Qing's wasn't a big threat to him, he laughed cruelly and focused on his black blood attack. Except only a moment later, his face fell and he looked down at his chest. Within the flesh and blood of his wound, there was a crushed fang and some scales. Even as he looked down, the flesh around his wound started to rot and decay, and poisoned blood started pouring out of the wound. Then, the rotting effect began to spread. Unbearable pain surged through him, forcing Flamecrow to unleash a blood-curdling scream. Immense terror filled his eyes. Continuing to fall back, he looked at Su Qing crouched some distance away, and noticed him toss aside a mass of shredded flesh and fangs. If you took that mass and put the pieces back together, it would look like the severed head of a snake. It was the very same viper Su Qing had used to dispose of corpses in the past. As for his left hand, it trembled slightly as he opened it up to reveal a crushed piece of amber. As the chunks of amber fell to the ground, they revealed the tail of a ghost-faced scorpion, pierced directly into Su Qing's palm. One hand contained a deadly venom used for attack, and the other gave him that slight burst of power he needed to break through the spirit power barrier. "You," Flamecrow growled. Then he howled in grief. He could barely talk, let alone think about escaping this battlefield alive. The terror in his eyes grew more intense as he tried to wipe the poisoned blood off of himself. However, it just kept pouring out of the wound, causing his life force to slowly fade. Su Qing took a deep breath as he knelt there. His battle with Fatmontin had proved to him how formidable the violet crystal's regenerative powers were. It also helped to prove definitively that the crystal could neutralize poisons. That fact was driven home when looking at his hand, which had been infected by the snake venom, yet wasn't rotting. This was the fatal attack he'd prepared. Standing up, he started moving toward Flamecrow. As Flamecrow watched Su Qing approach, the terror in his eyes turned into despair. He struggled to move away and even managed to desperately scream, "Captain, help!" Looking over, Captain Bloodshadow's eyes went wide. He wanted to save his subordinate, but Sergeant Thunder was making it impossible for him to do so. He could only watch as Su Qing closed in on Flamecrow with increasing speed. At this point, Flamecrow's mental state collapsed, and at the same time, the mutagen within him surged out of control. Even before Su Qing could reach him, he went stiff. Mutagen spread through him, and then a pop rang out as he exploded into a mist of blood. When experiencing mutation, some people turned into greenish-black corpses and others exploded. Su Qing stopped in place and gazed at the spot where the blood fog was now dissipating into the air. Then he turned with cold eyes to look at Sergeant Thunder and Captain Bloodshadow fighting. The evening sun was setting, but the dome of heaven looked different from before. Instead of welcoming the darkness of night, the entire sky seemed a strange red color. As that red color covered Su Qing, it combined with the wounds that crisscrossed his body and his cold eyes to create an indescribably intimidating image. It was something so intimidating that Captain Bloodshadow, whose cultivation base far surpassed Su Qing, trembled in fear. The miserable death experienced by Flamecrow had been a huge blow to him. The sustained combat with Sergeant Thunder and the sight of Su Qing fighting with such vicious tactics caused Captain Bloodshadow's mind to crack. Seeing Su Qing approaching, he threw a punch at Sergeant Thunder and then started backing away. He was done fighting. Sergeant Thunder was inclined to pursue him, but then he looked up at the bizarre redness in the sky, and his expression flickered. Seemingly affected on an emotional level, he suddenly coughed up a mouthful of blood. Then, as greenish-black coloring spread out across his skin, he started swaying back and forth as if about to topple over. Su Qing hurried over and offered him a steadying arm. Sergeant Thunder gasped for breath as Su Qing helped him over to a nearby tree and sat him down. Then Su Qing turned and looked at the fleeing Captain Bloodshadow. Sergeant Thunder grabbed his sleeve. "Don't go after him alone. He won't accomplish anything now that Squad Bloodshadow is wiped out." The old man looked up into the sky. "And this red sky, I feel like I've seen this before." "That man is a potential calamity," Su Qing said. He didn't like the idea of leaving loose ends around. What was more, he felt like he had an advantage in the Forbidden Region. If he could drag Flamecrow into death, maybe he could do the same with Captain Bloodshadow. However, Sergeant Thunder's words struck him, and he found himself looking up into the sky. Right then, the faint, indistinct sound of singing drifted through the jungle. All of the howling mutant beasts out in the trees went completely silent. The singing grew clearer. It was like a woman bitterly complaining about her husband's departure. As the song echoed, a thin red fog appeared in the area where Captain Bloodshadow sped away. The fog spread, covering everything in the area. Su Qing shivered, and Sergeant Thunder leaned up against the tree, also trembled. Both were looking in the direction the singing came from. The former seemed incomparably vigilant, while the latter seemed dazed or even confused. As the song entered Su Qing's ears, he felt an indescribable coldness filling him, almost like the coldness he felt in the blood rain back in the city ruins. Despite being in the third level of body refinement, he felt like he might not be able to take the cold. His teeth started chattering, and he felt like he couldn't move. His mind reeled as he suddenly thought back to the 3 dangers that Crucifix had mentioned back when they first entered the Forbidden Region. Off in the distance, Captain Bloodshadow suddenly stopped in place and started shaking. It was almost like some unseen figure had approached and was draining him of the power to run. As Su Qing watched, streams of white energy seeped out of Captain Bloodshadow's eyes, ears, nose, and mouth, and flowed into the surrounding blood fog. Then Captain Bloodshadow's body disintegrated, transforming into a desiccated corpse. Then the corpse collapsed into dust, leaving absolutely nothing behind. The floating fog then rolled across the ground toward Su Qing and Sergeant Thunder. As it neared, Su Qing trembled, and that was when he noticed that, in the spot where Captain Bloodshadow had died, there was a tattered pair of red women's boots. What? Su Qing's breath came in ragged pants, and his eyes were wide as he watched those boots start walking slowly toward him. Above the boots was nothing but the bitter song, getting closer and closer. It was as if an invisible woman wearing red boots was there, singing and walking. What was more, it seemed like she was walking specifically toward Su Qing. The bizarre scene caused his pupils to constrict, and he felt the urge to flee, except he couldn't move. He was so cold he was frozen in place, his teeth chattering loudly. He could only watch as the boots neared, step by step, until they were less than 2 meters away. The threat of death filled Su Qing's heart and mind, but he was stuck in place as countless blood-red strands of fog swirled toward him. The pair of red boots took another step in his direction, but then a hoarse, quavering voice spoke. It was Sergeant Thunder. "Tao Hung, is that you?" he asked, sounding uncertain. The moment he spoke, the strange song stopped. The boot, which had been about to step down, shifted direction. It made it seem like the woman had turned and was facing Sergeant Thunder. Sergeant Thunder shivered visibly and was having a hard time breathing steadily. He was exhausted and seemed to barely have the energy to stay conscious, yet his eyes shone with unprecedented brightness as he looked at the empty spot above the boots. It was as if his eyes were able to perceive a woman standing there, a woman who was incomparably important to him. They looked at each other, separated by the void by the world, as distantly as yin from yang. Sergeant Thunder, strong and resilient, couldn't stop the tears from welling up in his eyes and flowing down his cheeks. You're back," he said, reaching out with a trembling hand. The red boots slowly took a few more steps until they were right in front of him. The invisible woman seemed to be kneeling in front of Sergeant Thunder, tenderly taking his trembling hand and putting it onto her face. Except that Sergeant Thunder's hand wasn't touching anything. His hand dropped, and his tears flowed harder. He muttered something indecipherable yet filled with sorrow. A long moment passed and the woman sighed. The red boots turned around and walked away, circling around Su Qing, and then disappeared along with the red fog. "You ask when I'll return, my lord. I can't give a time." Hidden in the fog are scattered emotions. The song fades like smoke. The song continued, bitter and sorrowful, ever fading into the distance. The fog flowed past Su Qing and Sergeant Thunder. Eventually, the singing became too faint to hear and the fog vanished. Finally, Su Qing felt he could move again. Eyes filled with shock, he turned to look at Sergeant Thunder sitting there against the tree. The old man was looking off into the distance, tears still flowing down his face. Su Qing didn't say anything. He didn't ask any questions. Now wasn't the time. After a long while, Sergeant Thunder spoke in a soft voice. "I bet you're wondering what that was about." Su Qing nodded silently. "Like Crucifix said, I'm one of the few people who has heard the singing." He continued to gaze off into the distance. "You know, most people who hear it end up dying. Those who survive are rare indeed. Any who live to tell the tale receive a little gift from the forbidden region. And that is, the second time they hear the singing, they'll see the person they most want to see. I used to think it was just a story. And yet, it's because of that story that I've stayed in the base camp for decades, my hair turning white. Today, I saw it." As the words left his mouth, Sergeant Thunder seemed to grow much older. The wrinkles on his face deepened, and weakness spread through him. "Is there someone you're separated from as distantly as yin from yang?" Sergeant Thunder muttered bitterly. "If so, don't be like me. Don't wait around this place. I saw the one I wanted to see, but now I feel empty." He closed his eyes, yet the tears continued to flow through the wrinkles on his face and fall onto his clothing. Su Qing looked back to the spot where the singing had vanished, and felt himself being lost in memories. There were people he wanted to see. People he wanted to see very, very much. Deathblade's thoughts. This chapter is unusually long. In the future, I'll probably split chapters like this, but for now, I'm not going to worry about it. Thanks so much to Acheon, Jobby6488, and Unpale for the reviews. Urgen and I appreciate it a lot. Folded hands. Perhaps because of the singing, the cries of the mutant beasts never returned. That song seemed to be the sovereign of the jungle. Even after it left, everything stayed completely silent. Sergeant Thunder sat there quietly, staring off into the darkness. Mixed emotions could be seen on Su Qing's face. After a while, he shifted his attention to Savage Ghost's Wolf Tooth Club and Shattered Shield. Like the other corpses, Savage Ghost's body had turned into dust because of the singing. He no longer existed. Most scavengers didn't have family, so when they disappeared, few people cared. And even if they did have family, as the years passed, they would gradually be forgotten. Su Qing thought back to the slums, and one of the scholars that had treated him well. Before wasting away and dying of illness, that scholar had said something to the class. "True suffering is when you can't forget about someone you miss. True happiness is when someone else can't forget about you." Back then, Su Qing didn't really understand what he meant. But now, as he looked at Sergeant Thunder, he understood it completely. Instead of bothering the sergeant, he went over to the spot where Savage Ghost's corpse had lain earlier. Taking out his dagger, he dug a hole in the dirt. He hadn't known Savage Ghost very well, nor had he spoken much to him. But Savage Ghost had taught him about the jungle, and they had fought together in the battle against the wolves. Su Qing had also used Savage Ghost's shield to protect himself from that black blood. So Su Qing felt like he should do something. It was similar to how he'd cremated the corpses back in the city ruins. It took some effort, but he managed to dig a sizable hole. Inside of it, he buried Savage Ghost's Wolf Tooth Club and the remnants of his shield. Su Qing's expression was completely focused as he worked. Unbeknownst to him, Sergeant Thunder eventually turned his attention from the depths of the forest to Su Qing. He had the same surprised expression on his face as when he'd first laid eyes on Su Qing in the city ruins. After watching him bury Savage Ghost's equipment, he realized Su Qing was looking for something to act as a gravestone. "Scavengers don't need gravestones," Sergeant Thunder said quietly. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. That's the life of a scavenger. We struggle in life, so in death there's no reason for a ceremony. Being able to rest in peace is more than enough." Sergeant Thunder was getting weaker. His injuries were very serious, and he had a lot of mutagen in him. Only moments after speaking, he closed his eyes and lapsed into unconsciousness. Su Qing walked over, pulled out some 7-leaf clover, and shoved it into the old sergeant's mouth. He wasn't sure if it would do anything, but he knew that it was an ingredient in the white boluses. Even if it dispelled a tiny bit of mutagen, it might help. Having accomplished that, he managed to get Sergeant Thunder onto his back and tie him in place with some strips of torn cloth. Taking a deep breath, he started running through the jungle. Upon passing the spot where Captain Bloodshadow had died, he noticed an animal hide sack, which he grabbed. Unfortunately, it contained random items and no medicinal pills. About an hour later, Sergeant Thunder regained consciousness. It took him a moment to realize he was on Su Qing's scrawny back and that they were running. With his eyes open, he could only see the side of Su Qing's face. He said nothing. However, Su Qing could sense that he was awake. "Feeling better?" he asked. "You can keep sleeping. It'll be a few more hours. I think we can get out of the forbidden region by daybreak." Sergeant Thunder didn't respond immediately. He was old, and it was getting harder to hide how weak he was. With some effort he looked up at the dark sky, but it was hard to see. He could tell that he would pass out again soon. "Kid," he murmured, "do you know why I took you with me when we left that city?" Continuing to run, Su Qing shook his head. Voice even fainter, Sergeant Thunder asked, "Remember what you were doing when we met?" "I remember." Su Qing ran up a fallen log, then jabbed his hand out to grab a mutant lizard hiding in the shadows. Continuing to move, he threw it out in front of him. As soon as the lizard smacked into the ground, a host of writhing vines reached out and wrapped around it. The vines stabbed into the lizard's armor like scales and began sucking out its flesh and blood. Taking advantage of the situation, Su Qing leaped over the vines and continued on his way. Sergeant Thunder continued talking, but his voice was getting so faint it was hard to hear him. "When I saw you cremating all those bodies, with the fire shining on you, it seemed like you had brought a bit of warmth and kindness into this brutal world." Su Qing stopped running for a moment. Sergeant Thunder again fell into unconsciousness. After taking a few deep breaths, Su Qing once again ran through the depths of the jungle. Time passed. Before long 2 hours had gone by. Su Qing managed to avoid all dangers and continued onward to the periphery of the jungle. When the night sky was at its darkest, the cold in the forbidden region reached its peak. Thankfully, Su Qing was constantly on the move, which kept his body warm and fought back against the iciness. And yet, the coldness grew more intense. After enough time had passed for an incense stick to burn, Su Qing felt like the encroaching cold was overpowering the heat within him. Expression grim, he looked at the road ahead. In front of him was a wall of thick fog. It was different from the blood fog that had come with the singing, and didn't seem oppressive and dangerous. However, he could tell that once he got into that fog, it would be impossible to see anything clearly. The darkness of night made it even worse. Su Qing wished he could avoid it, but even after running parallel to it for quite some time, he saw no end to it. He knew what this fog was. When he first entered the forbidden region, Crucifix and Graceful Raptor had spoken of the dangers here, and one was called the Fog of Confusion. Anyone who entered that fog would end up lost inside of it. Once it formed, it would take a long time for it to dispel naturally. Su Qing had the feeling that he could just wait out the fog, since the mutagen in him wouldn't cause a problem. But Sergeant Thunder was getting weaker and weaker. If the sergeant got stuck because of the fog, it was possible he could experience mutation and die. As a result, Su Qing had no choice but to back up and keep trying to find a way around. However, the fog was just too all-encompassing. Despite moving as quickly as possible, he eventually reached a point where he couldn't get out of the way of the expanding fog, and it swept over him. Yet, before long, the fog in the area immediately surrounding him grew thin, until he was left standing there looking confused. He looked down at his feet. He couldn't have a shadow in the middle of the dark night, but he could sense that the surrounding fog was being sucked into the area beneath his feet. It was as though he had an invisible shadow that was now a vortex, pulling in everything around it. The speed involved wasn't incredible, and after a short time, his shadow seemed to get full. At that point, the fog around Su Qing grew dense once again. However, after his shadow was finished absorbing the fog, power rebounded through Su Qing, traveling to his eyes. After that, the fog became transparent to him. Or maybe it wasn't that he could see what was around him, but rather could sense it. The fog was still there, and it was incomparably dense, but his senses had reached a level that he didn't feel lost within it. He looked at his feet again, yet still didn't see any shadow. "What are you?" he murmured. After a moment, he looked around for a moment, then started moving again, trying to maintain top speed as he slipped through the fog like a specter. Before long, he saw other living people in the fog. They were two scavengers that he remembered seeing back in the base camp. They were clasping hands as they moved like blind people through the fog, slowly but surely feeling their way ahead. However, Su Qing could tell that what they thought was forward movement was actually leading them in a circle. Perhaps they knew that too, as they were sweating profusely and seemed to be in the midst of despair. After glancing at them, Su Qing looked away and prepared to move on. He was not the kind of person who overflowed with sympathy. He lived in a brutal world and wouldn't save people unless there was a reason. He had seen many situations in the slums in which the person being saved turned around and harmed their rescuer. However, though the fog blocked sight, It didn't block sound, and the two scavengers detected the sound of Su Qing's footsteps as he passed. Nervous expressions overtook their face, as they couldn't tell if the footsteps belonged to a human or an animal. One of them suddenly released a ferocious howl, apparently hoping to frighten away the newcomer. In contrast, the other scavenger cried out for help, and in a show of good faith, he pulled out a white bolus and some spirit coins from his sack, offering them as payment to be led to safety. Su Qing stopped moving and looked at the white bolus. Sergeant Thunder seemed very weak laying there on his back. After some thought, he reached to his own sack and pulled out a candle. When he lit it, the flame was weak, but it was enough to push away the fog. Putting the candle on the ground, he backed up a bit and then looked back toward the two scavengers. "Walk 7 paces to your left," he said, "then 10 paces to your right." Upon hearing his voice, the two scavengers trembled. Looks of wild hope appeared on their faces as they immediately followed Su Qing's instructions. Thanks to Su Qing, the two men threaded their way past some dangerous areas, and were soon in the area where the flame of his candle had dispersed the fog in the immediate area. Upon entering that area and seeing the candle, they rushed over excitedly to stand next to it. Su Qing was a few paces off, still visible, but deep enough in the foggy darkness that the two scavengers couldn't make him out clearly. "Give me that white bolus," he said coolly. The one with the bolus shivered. Given that he'd just been given a new lease on life, he took out the bag of spirit coins and white bolus and tossed them to Su Qing, offering his thanks along with it. The other man also seemed about ready to pull out a medicinal pill, but then he looked at Su Qing and suddenly seemed to change his mind. Although he couldn't see Su Qing clearly, there was enough of him visible to make it obvious he was a scrawny young man with an unconscious person on his back. The scavenger's eyes glittered and he smiled. "I already consumed all my white boluses, young friend, but don't worry. Once the fog is gone, or if you have a way to get us out of here, I'll make sure to repay you." His eyes flashed as he looked at Su Qing, as if he was thinking about making a move. His companion was also seeming to have second thoughts at having handed over his pills and coins so quickly. Su Qing looked at the white bolus and then the scavengers. He didn't say anything. Instead, he waved his hand, causing a wind to blow out and extinguish the candle. Instantly, darkness and fog returned to the area. Approaching the man who'd just spoken, Su Qing grabbed his sack away from him. "Never mind," Su Qing said. "You can just stay here." Wait, I'm sorry, it was a mistake. You can have my white boluses, He reached out as if to grab his sack back, but his foot caught on a protruding root and he fell to the ground. Climbing back to his feet, he panted and looked around with regret in his eyes. "Let me explain, young friend, Su Qing ignored him and walked in the direction of the man who'd given him the white boluses, who looked alarmed at being thrust back into the fog. As Su Qing passed him, he coolly said, "Follow the sound of my footsteps." Without another word and without looking back, he continued on his way. Behind him, the man followed, now rejoicing that he'd been so quick to hand over the requested items. That was especially true when he heard the mournful cries of the other man, and how they soon turned into wild curses. No matter what that man said, he couldn't remove the despair from his voice. As the follower continued after Su Qing, he trembled and felt deep respect growing within him. Deathblade's thoughts. Many thanks to Squid Dragon, Asura /Va, Kining, M. Lavarius, Zero Life Night Vision, and Evil Fruits for the reviews. It's very much appreciated. Seriously, y'all are amazing and have blown me away with the reviews. Thank you. Su Qing didn't pay attention to the man following him. As he continued through the fog, he fed the white bolus to Sergeant Thunder. Whether it was because of the pill or the 7-leaf clover, the greenish-black color had stopped spreading across his face. However, there was still too much mutagen within him. Not even the white bolus was enough to reverse its effects. Because of that, he remained unconscious. What he had experienced in this mission in the Forbidden Region had been too much for him. And thus, in the depths of the night, Su Qing continued through the fog. Along the way, he encountered more scavengers, with whom he traded white boluses in exchange for safe passage out. All they had to do was follow his footsteps. There were some fools who didn't cooperate. They became stark examples for the people who agreed to follow Su Qing, and the respect in the latter group grew. All of them had come to the conclusion that Su Qing was one of those rare people born with psychic powers. After all, that was the only type of person who could deal with the fog of confusion. Graceful Raptor had told Su Qing about people like that. When he'd traded for the white boluses, he was also thinking about this, and let the misunderstanding happen so as to conceal his real secrets. After giving Sergeant Thunder over a dozen white boluses, his complexion had improved. Instead of being greenish-black, it was just greenish. He also seemed to have an easier time breathing. At the same time, Su Qing realized that his shadow couldn't feed power into him for very long. As he moved onward, he realized that the fog wasn't as transparent as before. Things started getting hazy until, eventually, he was seeing the same thing as everyone else. Thankfully, he was already close to leaving the fog. Despite losing his ability to see clearly, he moved even faster than before. Darkness was fading from the sky, and the morning sun peeked over the distant horizon. As the light of dawn spilled over the lands, Su Qing finally emerged from the foliage with Sergeant Thunder on his back. He felt a bit emotional as he sped out into the outside world and left the jungle behind. No longer was he surrounded by sinister coldness. Instead, he felt a gentle breeze and warm sunlight. In fact, the sun forced him to squint as he stood there, taking in great breaths of fresh air. Those who had been following him also emerged, and were finally able to see their surroundings clearly. They had all lived through a perilous ordeal in which they almost died. Every member of that disparate group was excited. One old man even dropped onto his hands and knees and kissed the dirt. It was only at this point that they were able to see who they had been following. It was young Su Qing, carrying Sergeant Thunder. Only a few of them recognized the former, but all of them were familiar with the latter. This was a sight they wouldn't forget, and Su Qing himself had made a deep impression on them. "Kid, Sergeant Thunder." Then Su Qing glanced back at them, and they instinctively closed their mouths. Truth be told, the way Su Qing had dealt with the evil-hearted scavengers he had encountered left this group of survivors with feelings of awe. Ignoring the followers, Su Qing was just about to start running again when he saw two figures racing in their direction. They were none other than Crucifix and Graceful Raptor. They had not returned to the base camp, but had instead been waiting anxiously just outside the Forbidden Region. And they had already decided that if Sergeant Thunder and the rest of the squad members didn't emerge soon, they would go back in to rescue them. Then they saw Su Qing off in the distance and raced to his side. When Crucifix laid eyes on Sergeant Thunder, his pupils constricted. Then he looked at Su Qing and his gaze softened. Graceful Raptor also looked shocked, and killing intent burned in her eyes as she glared at the people following Su Qing. The group shrank back, panting in anxiety. "They weren't involved," Su Qing said. "In fact, I have them to thank. Without their aid, Sergeant Thunder wouldn't have made it." Graceful Raptor's killing intent faded, and the followers breathed sighs of relief. Clasping hands and bowing in both respect and thanks, they went their own ways. After they were gone, Crucifix stepped forward to take Sergeant Thunder off of Su Qing's back. Su Qing stopped him. "Let him sleep," he said. "I'm fine." "Fine," Crucifix said. "Let's get back to the base camp and get the Sarge to the physician." He took out another white bolus for Sergeant Thunder. Then the three of them raced toward the camp. Along the way, Graceful Raptor seemed to be working hard to keep her mouth shut. But finally, she couldn't help but ask, "What about Savage Ghost? Is Squad Bloodshadow still following you?" Su Qing took a moment before answering. Savage Ghost experienced mutation and died in battle. Crucifix and Graceful Raptor stopped in place. Though they had been prepared for an answer like this, they couldn't prevent their eyes from filling with grief. Graceful Raptor looked downright despondent. However, the next thing that Su Qing said left them completely astonished. Squad Bloodshadow was wiped out. "That's how the Sarge got hurt so bad," Graceful Raptor muttered, "and also why his mutagen levels are so severely high." Graceful Raptor seemed content with the explanation, but Crucifix had a dubious expression on his face, as though he suspected there were more to the story. He even gave Su Qing a deep look. However, he didn't ask any further questions. Nor did Su Qing offer any explanations or mention the singing. That was Sergeant Thunder's secret to keep, and it was Su Qing's place to make decisions about revealing it. The three of them raced back to the base camp, immediately heading to the caravan area in the middle, where the famous physician was taking patients. When Squad Thunderbolt appeared, the others waiting in line could sense their somber and desolate mood, and when they saw the unconscious Sergeant Thunder, they moved out of the way. Thus, Squad Thunderbolt took the first place in line outside the physician's tent. It was a big tent that emanated a medicinal aroma. Guards in plate armor stood by in the tent, where the physician was examining a scavenger who had a pained expression on his face. The physician was a skinny old man wearing a clean gray robe. He had a wrinkled face, but his eyes were lively and full of wisdom. In fact, they sparkled like stars, making it seem like he could see into the heart of whomever he looked at. He was flanked by a young man and a young woman. The young man seemed about the same age as Xianxia. He wore a blue silk garment and his hair was tied with a black jade headband. Hanging at his waist was a piece of fine jade carved into the shape of a dragon, with a golden tassel that spread out on the cushion he sat on. He was handsome and well-kempt, but seemed like he was barely awake. His chin currently rested in his palm, and though he had an alchemy textbook in the other hand, he wasn't even looking at it. Instead, he kept yawning. On the other side of the physician was a young woman of about 16 or 17 years of age. She wore a long blue skirt and had a waterfall of black hair that framed a perfect oval face. Her skin was as fair as snow, and her facial features were outstandingly beautiful. Her eyes, bright and clear, sparkled like the stars, and when she glanced at her companion and saw him dozing off, she smiled, then returned her attention to the medicinal codex she was studying. When she smiled, her eyes became like crescent moons overflowing with lingering charm. Her facial expression seemed noble, ensuring that anyone who looked at her would marvel at her grace and elegance. This lovely young pair exuded a purity that scavengers rarely saw. In their presence, graceful Raptor felt a bit self-conscious, and Crucifix couldn't hold back from glancing at them repeatedly. As for Xianxia, he was mostly interested in the medicinal books they were studying. Upon seeing them, his eyes glinted with envy. Then he forced his eyes away from the books and focused on the physician. The physician was currently explaining a few things to his scavenger patient. The scavenger offered profuse thanks, then left, whereupon the physician washed his hands in a copper bowl off to the side, then looked at Xianxia and the others. His gaze stopped briefly on Xianxia, and he looked a bit closer at him, then went on to look at Sergeant Thunder. "Put him down here," he said. For some reason, Xianxia felt nervous when the old physician looked at him. It was the same feeling he remembered when attending class with the scholars back in the slums. With Crucifix's help, he set Sergeant Thunder down carefully in front of the physician. Sergeant Thunder's eyes flickered open, and he looked around in surprise. Then he saw everyone around him and was about to struggle into a sitting position. "Lay still," the physician said coolly. Sergeant Thunder looked up at him and their eyes met. Then Sergeant Thunder continued to struggle up. Crucifix hurried forward and helped him to his feet. When Sergeant Thunder was able, he clasped hands to the physician. "I got hurt, so they brought me here. I don't want to cause you any trouble, Grandmaster Bai. I'm fine." "You know me?" the old physician asked curiously. Sergeant Thunder nodded and respectfully said, "A few years ago I had a chance to see you from a distance." Grandmaster Bai looked at him deeply for a moment. "Your injury isn't severe, and the mutagen in you has already been suppressed, but your mental state is an issue. You've obviously had some big ups and downs emotionally, and it's damaged your heart and blood vessels. Combine everything and it's troublesome. I can treat you, but the real issue doesn't have to do with the recent injuries. You sustained internal injuries years ago, didn't you? Someone crippled your cultivation base, though you managed to rebuild it over the years, which is quite an accomplishment. However, when you combine everything that's happened to you, you can say that you've overtaxed your system in a way that common herbs and minerals can't treat. Not even I have the ability to fix you. I'll give you some medicine that will help a bit. The rest will be up to luck. There's one thing you need to realize. Going forward, you cannot practice cultivation or do breathing exercises. If you do, the mutagen will cause your old internal injury to flare up, and then you'll die beyond the shadow of a doubt." Crucifix and Graceful Raptor took in Grandmaster Bai's words without comment. Clearly, they were aware that Sergeant Thunder's cultivation base had been crippled in the past, but it was Xianxia's first time hearing of the matter. Looking at Sergeant Thunder, he thought back to the singing and the blood-colored women's boots. "There's nothing else we can do?" Crucifix asked gloomily. "There is," Grandmaster Bai replied. "If you could find a precious material such as a lifespan flower, he might get a new lease on life. A few years ago, I heard that the forbidden region here produced one such flower." Crucifix didn't respond and Graceful Raptor seemed worried. But when Xianxia looked at Sergeant Thunder, the man looked calm, and he even gave a faint smile. "It's not a big deal," Sergeant Thunder said. "Just an old injury. I'm sorry for bothering you, Grandmaster Bai." Clasping hands once again, Sergeant Thunder gathered Xianxia and the others to leave. After everyone had offered formal thanks, they took the medicine prescribed by Grandmaster Bai and left. As for Xianxia, he had the feeling that, when they had clasped hands upon leaving, Grandmaster Bai had been looking closely at him. After leaving the physician's tent, the surviving members of Squad Thunderbolt didn't say anything to each other. They returned to Sergeant Thunder's residence, where both Crucifix and Graceful Raptor seemed like they wanted to say something. Sergeant Thunder interrupted and told them to leave. When they were gone, Sergeant Thunder got some tobacco from his cabin, took a pipe out of his sack, and started smoking. As the smoke drifted about, he sighed and looked at Su Qing with an expression of concern. Waving away some of the smoke, he smiled and said, "I couldn't even think about smoking in the Forbidden Region, but now we're back. This feels great. Smoking is much better than any kind of medicine." Su Qing opened his mouth to reply, but Sergeant Thunder cut him off. "What do you want to eat? I'll cook, and we can drink together." From what Su Qing could tell, Sergeant Thunder wasn't interested in talking about the recent events. After a moment, Su Qing nodded. "Let's eat snake." Deathblade's thoughts. Thanks so much for the review, Penguinos. Long live the F5 sect. The scavenger base camp was known to have everything required for day-to-day life. Also, it had a lot of meat. Because of its proximity to the Forbidden Region, scavengers came and went on a daily basis, and they needed to eat meat. So there were vendor stalls set up for just that purpose. Upon hearing that Su Qing wanted to eat snake, a vibrant smile broke out on Sergeant Thunder's wrinkled face. It wasn't lost on him that Su Qing obviously remembered his love of snake meat. Before Su Qing could go out, though, the old man blocked his path. "There are a lot of crafty people in this camp," he said, "and you're not familiar with all the mutant beasts that live in the Forbidden Region. More than likely, you'll end up getting scammed. I'll buy the meat." Upon hearing the word scam, Su Qing subconsciously rubbed his iron skewer, thought for a moment, then said, "Nobody's gonna be scamming me." Sergeant Thunder eyed the skewer, then laughed involuntarily. Without another word, he walked out. After the old man was gone, Su Qing went to the kitchen, carefully cleaned everything up, and then set the table. The last thing he did was place a third set of tableware down. As he put the extra bowl and chopsticks out, he suddenly realized something. The third set is for someone who will never come. Thinking back to those words, he moved the third set of tableware next to Sergeant Thunder's place at the table. He did the same with the third chair. Having accomplished these things, he looked back out at the courtyard. It was evening, and a cold wind blew a few snowflakes along with it. In the eastern part of South Phoenix, the end of the third month was when warmth returned to the lands. Plants bloomed and animals awoke from hibernation, but winter rarely relinquished its hold willingly and used the occasional snowfall to remind everyone it was still around. As dusk grew deeper, the wind carried more and more snowflakes into the courtyard. As they fell from heaven into the world of men, however, they landed on the ground and melted. Eventually, everything was muddy. No matter how high of a vantage point one could attain, and no matter how clean that person was, it was impossible to avoid the reality that the human world was filled with filth that could never be wiped clean. It was hard to say if the coldness of the wind caused the snowflakes to appear, or if the appearance of the snowflakes caused the wind to become colder. Either way, as the wind blew across the lands, through the base camp, and into the courtyard, Su Qing felt chilled to the bone. He was a cultivator, but still couldn't forget the deep-seated fear of the cold that he had harbored for years. As such, he felt uncomfortable. Eventually, he noticed a figure lurching along through the cold wind and snow. When the figure opened the gate to the courtyard and stepped inside, he was smiling. "We got lucky, kid. Look at this. It's a safflower snake. Their meat is exceptionally good. You just wait, I'm going to show you how good I am in the kitchen." With that, Sergeant Thunder carried the dead snake inside. When he saw how clean the kitchen was and how the table had been set, his smile widened. Looking at Su Qing, he asked, "Want to learn how to cook a snake?" "Yeah," Su Qing replied, his eyes shining. He loved learning new things, and besides, he already knew how well Sergeant Thunder could cook. Smiling, Sergeant Thunder beckoned Su Qing to his side and started working, explaining as he did. "You know, most people think you should cut off both the snake's head and tail when you cook it. Well, the snake's excretions come from the tail area, so you do need to remove that part, but not the head. As long as you're careful to remove the venom, the head will add a lot of flavor to the dish as a whole." Sergeant Thunder absolutely loved talking about cooking. Su Qing watched and listened carefully as Sergeant Thunder cleaned the snake, skinned it, removed the offal, then prepared the meat. "Remember, kid, if you just eat the meat plain, it won't have any flavor. You need a good broth to go along with." Sergeant Thunder started boiling some water in an earthenware pot, then added numerous herbs and spices. Finally, he put the snake head in. Before long, a fragrant aroma filled the air, and Su Qing started salivating. Seeing this, Sergeant Thunder laughed heartily, took out a clean wok, and stir-fried the rest of the meat. Hissing and popping sounds filled the kitchen, and the fragrant aroma grew so strong it drifted outside. The frigid coldness was driven away, and Su Qing's stomach rumbled loudly. As he looked at the sizzling snake meat, his eyes grew wider and wider. Finally, Sergeant Thunder finished frying the meat, whereupon he dumped it into the earthenware pot and closed the lid. "Are you going to remember all that?" he asked. Su Qing eyed the earthenware pot and nodded. The process didn't seem very hard as far as he was concerned. Sergeant Thunder smiled, left the kitchen, and came back with 2 flagons of liquor. One he gave to Su Qing, the other he kept. Taking a sip, he sighed. "Meat's easy to find in this camp, but liquor, it's a lot more rare." Su Qing lifted the flagon and looked at the cloudy liquid inside. He'd never consumed alcohol before. According to Sergeant Thunder, liquor was rare, and Su Qing remembered that alcohol didn't even exist back in the slums. Only adults in the city had drunk it. Seeing how much Sergeant Thunder seemed to enjoy it, Su Qing put the flagon to his lips and drank a mouthful. It burned, but he forced himself to swallow. Warmth slid down his throat and into his belly, where it seemed to explode, sending out a current of heat into the rest of his body. He exhaled, nearly coughing, and could smell the alcohol on his own breath. "It's disgusting," he said, looking at Sergeant Thunder. The old man threw his head back and roared with laughter. Pointing at Su Qing, he said, "You're too young to appreciate the flavor of liquor. You'll like it when you're older." With that, he reached out to take the flagon from Su Qing. However, Su Qing pulled it away. "Let me try again." He took another drink, and though he frowned, he felt like he was already getting used to the unusual flavor. Time passed as they drank together, Sergeant Thunder poking fun and joking with Su Qing the entire time. Eventually, the meat was done. When Sergeant Thunder put the earthenware pot on the table and removed the lid, the delicious aroma billowed out. Su Qing felt his throat twitching. Putting the flagon down, he waited for Sergeant Thunder to take the first piece of meat. Then he used his own chopsticks to stab a piece and put it in his mouth. As before, he couldn't hold back from wolfing down the food like he usually did. And thus, as the snow fell outside and the wind blew, an old man and a young one ate and drank together, warmth filling them. As Sergeant Thunder watched Su Qing awkwardly work with the chopsticks, a tender look appeared in his eyes. "He's a good kid. It's too bad he lives in such a brutal world." The cabin had cracks in it, which allowed bits of snow to blow inside. When they landed on Su Qing, it didn't matter that he was sweating from the food. He still didn't like the cold sensation and huddled in on himself a bit. Sergeant Thunder noticed, but didn't say anything. Time passed. Su Qing watched how Sergeant Thunder drank and learned from him, taking a sip, then exhaling the fragrance of the alcohol. At a certain point, he looked at this old man who had taken him out of the city ruins and said, "Your injury." "I'll be okay. I've dealt with it for years now. I won't die easily, I'm fine." Su Qing nodded. He wanted to ask about how Sergeant Thunder's cultivation base got crippled to begin with, but after thinking back to what happened in the Forbidden Region, he held his tongue. They enjoyed the meal for quite a while, until finally Sergeant Thunder finished his alcohol. At that point the old man stood, his eyes a bit cloudy as he returned to his cabin. Su Qing suddenly realized that the trip to the Forbidden Region had taken away some of the sergeant's previous imposing manner. He sat alone for a time before getting up to clean the kitchen and wash the dishes. When the work was done, he went back to his cabin. Sitting on the bed, he watched the snow falling outside the window, and eventually curled up and took out the sack that had once belonged to Captain Bloodshadow. There were no medicinal pills inside, but there were a lot of spirit coins, as well as some random things. There was a set of black gauntlets made, not from leather but metal. Su Qing tried them on and found that they were very tough and would be a big advantage to his defenses. He threw a few experimental punches and was very happy with the results. Taking the gauntlets off, he sat down and went into some breathing exercises. The night passed without incident. It was still snowing in the morning, but it was warmer than the previous night. However, there was enough leftover cold that the snow stuck. Upon walking out of his cabin, Su Qing saw the snow on the ground and wrapped his clothes a bit tighter around him. Glancing at Sergeant Thunder's cabin, he left the courtyard. His goal for the morning was to find some white boluses to buy for the sergeant. His feet crunched in the snow as he headed toward the general store. Along the way, he passed by Grandmaster Bai's tent, where he heard the voices of that young man and woman from the day before. They were reading books aloud, which caused Su Qing to stop and listen enviously. After a short time, he looked away from the tent and continued to the general store. As he neared, he saw the girl from the beast trial working hard to sweep the snow from the front of the store. Her garments were tattered, her hands were red, and her breath puffed in front of her as she worked. He hadn't seen her for a few days, but it seemed that she was already used to life in the base camp. She looked tired, but she was working spiritedly. The snow still fell, but she swept anyway. In the morning light, the scar on her face seemed even more prominent. She noticed him as she approached and looked up. She smiled. "Morning." "Morning," Su Qing mumbled back. He wasn't used to calling out greetings. Nodding at her, he looked into the store. Perhaps because it was early, or perhaps it was the cold, but either way the store was empty. "What do you want to buy?" the girl asked. "I'll get it for you." He looked at her. "White boluses." Placing her broom against the wall, she led Su Qing inside. Running to one of the counters, she rummaged around and pulled out a few sacks. Looking through them, she picked one specific sack and handed it to Su Qing. "The owner said we can only sell 5 per day," she said, looking a bit sheepish. Su Qing took the sack and looked through it carefully. To his surprise, the white boluses inside were of a much higher quality than the ones he'd purchased before. In fact, 3 of them didn't have any green coloration at all and emitted a faint medicinal aroma. Thinking about how the girl had been so specific about which bag to take out, Su Qing looked up at her. She blinked a few times, smiled, and then said, "Don't worry about it. I'm allowed to do this." "Thank you." She flashed a radiant smile. "No need for thanks. I should be thanking you. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be alive right now." Her words seemed to remind her of something, so as she escorted Su Qing to the door, she quietly said, "I heard the shop owner mention that a lot of young people have gone missing in the Forbidden Region recently, and based on his expression, I got the impression he didn't think it was because of the Forbidden Region itself. More like people are responsible. Just be careful." From the look in the girl's eyes, she seemed to be genuinely concerned about him, and Su Qing wasn't really sure how to respond. Nodding, he thanked her and left. Some distance away, he looked over his shoulder and saw that the girl once again was sweeping the snow. For some reason, her scar seemed very prominent on her face. All of a sudden, Su Qing remembered Sergeant Thunder's story about how the temple in the Forbidden Region had some sort of crystal that could remove scars. "If I have a chance, I'll get one of them for her." As he walked away, he left a trail through the snow. Behind him, the snow fell harder. Deathblade's thoughts. Thank you to Deathwalker, Taoist Filth, Slayer KH, Eric Rasputin, the last Taoist, and Venerable Tengoku for the reviews. Very much appreciated. I'm really taken aback by all the reviews. Incidentally, it's been a while since I posted on Wuxia World. I like this favorite chapter feature. I'm adding this one to my list. Su Qing walked through the wind and snow back to the courtyard. Before he even entered, he heard Sergeant Thunder laughing from inside. He also heard the sound of barking. Pushing open the main gate, he saw about a dozen stray dogs in the courtyard. They froze in place, looking at him coldly, and he looked back. He didn't do anything threatening, just look at them, yet they still growled and backed away from him, their hackles raised. He heard talking coming from Sergeant Thunder's cabin. Then the door opened and Crucifix and Graceful Raptor walked out. Upon seeing Su Qing and then the stray dogs, Crucifix grinned. Kneeling, Graceful Raptor patted the head of the nearest dog, smiled, and said, "They're saying you have a very strong, baleful aura, kid." Su Qing didn't respond, but instead looked over at Sergeant Thunder, who was also walking out of the cabin. The old man wore a thick leather jerkin and had a pipe in his hand. Gesturing at Graceful Raptor, he said, "My little girl Graceful Raptor said that, because of my injury, she's worried about my safety in the camp. So she assigned these dogs to guard the courtyard." There was additional meaning to Sergeant Thunder's words that Su Qing picked up on. Because Su Qing hadn't told anyone about how they heard the singing, Sergeant Thunder had returned the favor and not revealed the details of what Su Qing had accomplished. Su Qing nodded, then pulled out the bag of white boluses and tossed them to Sergeant Thunder. The old man glanced at them and smiled. All right, I have to admit I need these things, but from now on don't go buying them for me. I have enough money saved up to buy them for myself." Crucifix. He looked at the man. "Now that the kid's back, you can tell him." The smile left Crucifix's face, to be replaced by a more somber expression. "We came for 2 reasons. The first was to bring that special medicine for the Sarge, Graceful Raptor, and I bought enough to last for a month. Once that supply is used up, we'll get more." At this point, Crucifix pulled a sack of animal hide out and placed it off to the side. The second matter, he continued, is this. Because Squad Bloodshadow was completely eliminated, our squad brought in the biggest harvest of 7-leaf clovers. Other scavengers brought in bits and pieces, but nowhere close to us. Yesterday, Graceful Raptor and I went to hand our collection in to the camp owner, and we got a big reward. However, the camp owner is as stingy as ever, and instead of giving us 3 dust-purging pills, he only gave us 1. Crucifix looked at Graceful Raptor. She pulled out 4 sacks, put one off to the side, and also took out a wooden box. Upon opening the box, Su Qing could see a pigeon egg-sized medicinal pill inside, cyan in color. The medicinal aroma that wafted off of it was vastly superior to that of a white bolus. Savage Ghost didn't have any family, so I split his share between the rest of us. These 4 bags are the spirit coin reward, and as for the dust-purging pill. Crucifix looked at Sergeant Thunder, obviously waiting for him to make a decision about what to do with it. Give it to the kid, the old man said coolly. At that moment there was no question that he was in charge of Squad Thunderbolt. Crucifix nodded. Graceful Raptor looked surprised, then thoughtful. Both of them had asked Sergeant Thunder what happened in the jungle, but the sergeant never answered their questions. But given his decision regarding the loot, it was now fairly obvious. As for Savage Ghost's share, you split it up right. After all, we're his family. With a sigh, Sergeant Thunder picked up his share of the reward, as did Crucifix and Graceful Raptor. Su Qing followed suit. Then Graceful Raptor offered Su Qing the dust-purging pill. Su Qing glanced at Sergeant Thunder first, and from the look in his eye, realized the old man was very serious about his decision. Su Qing took the pill. There was some further chatting, primarily between Crucifix, Graceful Raptor, and Sergeant Thunder. Su Qing remained silent as usual and just listened to the conversation. That said, Crucifix and Graceful Raptor didn't ignore him and even asked him a few questions now and then. Time passed. Eventually, it was noontime, and the snow had stopped falling temporarily. Crucifix and Graceful Raptor bid farewell and prepared to leave. Just before leaving through the main gate, Crucifix turned to Su Qing and said, "Kid, Graceful Raptor and I took a mission. We'll be gone for a while, so you take care of the Sarge while we're away." Then he pulled out a dagger which he handed to Su Qing. "Your old dagger is too rusty. Use this one instead. It's sharp." Next, Graceful Raptor gave Su Qing a whistle. "Kid, you're strong, but you need eyes around the camp sometimes and maybe even other help. This whistle will give you rudimentary control of the stray dogs in the camp. When you need them, blow the whistle. They're smart, and they'll be able to figure out what you need." Then the two of them offered him some more advice and warnings. Finally, they clasped hands to Su Qing and took their leave. Watching them leave, Su Qing put the whistle away and tucked the new dagger into his boot. However, he didn't throw his old dagger away. Eventually, Crucifix and Graceful Raptor disappeared from sight, so Su Qing turned back to look at Sergeant Thunder's cabin. Then he made his way past all the dogs into his cabin. There, he sat down cross-legged to meditate. The wind screamed outside and more snow fell. The snow in the sky seemed to merge with the snow on the ground, seeping through the cracks in cabins and tents alike, startling those within. Sergeant Thunder was resting in his cabin, but he had long since grown used to the freezing wind and hardly noticed. However, the old man couldn't help but recall the image of Su Qing huddling in on himself because of the cold. He glanced over at Su Qing's cabin, then after some thought, put on a leather snow hat and walked out. In the blink of an eye, 3 days passed. During that entire time, the snow fell hard. Every time it seemed like it would stop, it came back with renewed vigor. The snow didn't have time to melt, and eventually it built up thick on the ground. It was nasty weather, but scavengers lived harsh, cold lives anyway, and it couldn't compare to that. The population in the camp seemed to be growing slowly. Some people visited the physician, others headed to the forbidden region. Eventually, people noticed that Squad Bloodshadow hadn't returned. Rumors swirled. Then, a story started to spread that the squad had been wiped out in the forbidden region. At first, few people believed that story. After all, every member of Squad Bloodshadow was formidable and well known. That was especially true of their captain, who was one of the strongest experts in the camp. The squad had been into the forbidden region too many times to count, so it seemed unlikely that they would suffer a complete defeat. However, after 2 days passed in which there wasn't a hint of anyone from Bloodshadow coming back to the camp, people started to believe the rumors. Then people connected the fact that Sergeant Thunder had returned to the camp unconscious, and that Savage Ghost had seemingly disappeared. At that point, people started putting the puzzle pieces together. Regardless of the truth, Bloodshadow was gone, which meant that Thunderbolt was the strongest squad around. Because of that, whenever Su Qing went out into the camp, he noticed the respectful looks given to him by the other scavengers. Of course, they were giving respect to Squad Thunderbolt, not him personally. Either way, he was starting to get a bit suspicious as to why Sergeant Thunder was leaving early and coming back late every day. He seemed to be busy with some task, but Su Qing wasn't sure what. Of course, Su Qing knew that people had a right to privacy, so he didn't ask any questions. Furthermore, he had a lot of his own goals to work on. For one thing, he spent most of his time in his cabin working on his cultivation. Due to his hard work, his cultivation base improved, slowly increasing both his strength and speed. He also put time into studying his shadow. So far, he couldn't identify anything different about it. However, it did absorb the mutagen, which caused the mutation blotch on his arm to fade even further. His body felt pure and clean, which in turn made his cultivation progress even more quickly than before. 2 days later in the afternoon, when he was sitting in meditation and preparing to stabilize himself after his recent progress and possibly attempt a breakthrough into the 4th level of the sea and mountain incantation, he frowned, then opened his eyes. He heard dogs barking outside, and then realized someone was knocking on the main gate of the courtyard. Upon leaving his cabin, he checked to confirm that Sergeant Thunder wasn't around, then looked at the gate. Standing there was a scavenger with a hesitant expression on his face. It only took a moment for Su Qing to realize that this was one of the handful of people he had saved from the fog of confusion in the Forbidden Region. Upon seeing Su Qing, the scavenger clasped hands and bowed. "Brother Kid, it's me, Boneblade. How can I help you?" Su Qing replied in a cool tone, his face completely expressionless. Boneblade said. He hesitated briefly, then seemed to make up his mind. Gritting his teeth, he continued, "Brother Kid, I want to buy insurance from you. Here are 5 white boluses for the payment." He tossed a sack to Su Qing. Su Qing didn't catch it. Instead, he let it fall to the ground and looked suspiciously at the man. Around them, the stray dogs stared but didn't approach. Sensing Su Qing's suspicious attitude, Boneblade launched into a further explanation. As he talked, Su Qing gradually understood what he meant by insurance. The man was planning a trip to the poisonous dragon pond in the Forbidden Region. If he didn't return in 3 days, he wanted Su Qing to come rescue him. "Brother Kid, I'm not worried about the mutant beasts in the Forbidden Region. If they kill me, that's just fate. But I'm terrified of the fog of confusion. I really don't want to die in that fog." Su Qing had a somewhat odd expression on his face. He was really taken aback that Boneblade would ask for something like this. After some thought, he said, "What happens if you don't run into the fog during those 3 days? What if you make it out fine?" "You can keep the pills. I'll consider them a payment for peace of mind." Boneblade clasped hands and bowed deeply to Su Qing, a pleading expression on his face. Thinking about it some more, Su Qing opened the bag with the tip of his foot and examined the contents. There were 5 white boluses inside, and of course, he didn't need them. However, they were treated as currency in the camp, so in the end, he decided that he might as well take them. He nodded. Upon seeing that Su Qing was agreeing to the offer, Boneblade heaved a sigh of relief. Offering profound thanks, he bowed again and then left. Su Qing picked up the bag and looked at it again through narrowed eyes. He was a vigilant person by nature and didn't completely trust Boneblade. However, it didn't seem like this was a trap. If the fog didn't arise, he wouldn't have to do anything. And if Boneblade had the ability to predict when the fog would appear 3 days in advance, why would he need to hatch plots against people like Su Qing? That said, Su Qing didn't let his guard down, and would worry about dealing with the fog if and when it became an issue. Going back into his cabin, he started meditating again. The night passed quickly. The next morning at dawn, he finished his session of cultivation and looked out into the courtyard. The dogs were barking again. Heading out, he was met with a strange sight. Sergeant Thunder was packing his belongings into a number of packages and parcels, which he then tied onto the backs of the dogs. The dogs' tongues lolled out, and some seemed about to buckle under the weight. Wiping the sweat from his brow, Sergeant Thunder said, "Finished with your cultivation. Let's go. I want to take you somewhere." Smiling, he patted the head of the nearest dog, then opened the gate and beckoned for Su Qing to follow him. Su Qing was confused, but went along. The dogs followed them as they headed into the central part of the base camp. When they passed from the middle ring to the inner ring, they walked past more shops. Most of the houses were built with tiles and brick and seemed very sturdy. Eventually, they reached a large courtyard residence. Around the courtyard were 4 freestanding rooms with brick walls and tile roofs. They were much better than Su Qing's old cabin, being well built against the elements. Su Qing looked inside, then turned to Sergeant Thunder. "From now on, this is our home," the sergeant said with a smile. Home? Su Qing was stunned. After all, the word home was something that felt very unfamiliar to him. "I worked hard my whole life to save up money. Now that my health is failing, I want to live in comfort." Laughing heartily, Sergeant Thunder walked into the courtyard, followed by the dogs. He immediately started taking the packages off their backs. Su Qing stood there for a long moment, then slowly walked inside. Even the ground was paved with blue-gray bricks. He was just staring around absent-mindedly when Sergeant Thunder called to him for help. They worked for hours until night fell. It was still cold and windy, but when they got a fire going in the stove in Su Qing's room, warmth filled the place. There were no cracks in the walls, making it impossible for the wind to shove the coldness in. Su Qing felt himself warming up. "Not cold, is it?" Sergeant Thunder asked with a smile. "Nope, not cold." Su Qing looked at Sergeant Thunder, his eyes shining in the light of the fire. He really wasn't cold. In fact, he was warm, and it caused him to tremble to the core of his being. Some time passed, then Sergeant Thunder left for his own room, leaving Su Qing alone in front of the stove. "Holmes," he murmured. Meanwhile, Sergeant Thunder was in his own room, the smile still on his face. However, his face seemed flush. He coughed lightly, then swallowed to get rid of the acrid flavor it brought. Sighing, he looked out the window toward the forbidden region, reminiscence in his eyes. "I wish I could see her one more time." Deathblade's thoughts. "Hey everyone, I have a minor surgical procedure today. It's no big deal, but it will put me on bed rest for at least a day, maybe 2. The chapters will keep coming, but I'm not sure if I'll be able to check comments or give shoutouts to reviews like I've been doing. Once I'm fully back online, I will definitely give shoutouts to any reviews and also check through comments. I honestly don't know how painful it will be post-op. Maybe I'll be able to use my laptop to check things out while in bed. Or maybe I'll just watch movies all day. We'll see." That night Su Qing dreamed. This was his first time in 6 years sleeping in such a luxurious room. It was his first time being comfortable, without the cold biting at him. And thus, it was one of the first times in a long time that he dreamed. In his dream, the world wasn't a brutal place. The god's broken face didn't hang in the sky, and his father and mother were there with him. So was his older brother. Without a care in the world, he headed to class with his friends. Afterward, he returned to a warm home where he had a hot dinner with his family. Then he went to sleep feeling. Even in the dream, he couldn't quite make out the faces of his family. He tried, but it was like they were covered by a concealing mist. Early in the morning, he woke up, opened his eyes, and lay there in bed staring at the ceiling. He felt warm as he slowly emerged from his dream, and then he looked around. The room was built from gray bricks and tiles. There was a desk and a bed as well as a washroom. The floor still radiated a bit of warmth, left over from the fire in the stove last night. There was a woven rush mat on the floor, and there was even a bookshelf, though it was empty. Everything was simple, but to Su Qing, it was extremely luxurious. Taking a deep breath, he went to the washroom. After carefully putting his hands into the basin, he watched the muck slowly slide off of them before quickly pulling them out of the water. After looking down at them, he wiped them on his sides to get them dirty again. Then he looked in the mirror. He saw his overcoat, his long black hair, which was an absolute mess, and his face covered with dirt. He also saw his sparkling eyes. After looking at himself for a while, he peered out the window and his eyes turned cold. The snowstorm had passed, and the sun had risen, casting light over the lands to melt away the last snowfall of winter. Off in the distance, the melting snow in the trees revealed green buds, which indicated that spring was finally here. He walked out of his room and, as was his custom, looked over at Sergeant Thunder's room. The dogs in the courtyard didn't get up, but they wagged their tails in greeting. "I've got things to do," he thought, and his eyes filled with determination. Opening the courtyard gate, he walked out into the camp with a clear idea of where he was going. It was dawn, and there weren't a lot of scavengers up and about. He headed toward the caravan area. The guards watched him but didn't block his path. Eventually, he reached the physician's tent, whereupon he heard someone reading aloud from a book. After hesitating a moment, Su Qing quietly stood outside the tent and listened. The caravan guards looked at him curiously, then most of them looked away. A few kept their eyes on him. Su Qing ignored them. As he listened to the sound of reading from in the tent, he became thoroughly entranced. And eventually, he realized that it wasn't just someone reading, but rather the sound of some sort of test being administered. It was the girl he remembered seeing. She was saying, "Golden twistgrass, also known as three-leaf pearls or cold-dispelling grass, is a sedge plant known by the common name short-leaved killinga and is useful from root to tip. It's a perennial herb that grows in forested mountains and damp wilderness regions. In South Phoenix, it can be found in the southern prefectures of Rising Nether and Widespirit. It can diffuse the lungs and relieve coughing, can clear heat and resolve poisons, can dissipate blood stasis and reduce swelling, is effective against venomous snake bites, can be used to treat injuries from falls, fractures, contusions, and strains. It works well in combination with." At first the girl spoke with confidence, but the further along she got, the more hesitant she became. "It works well in combination with what?" Grandmaster Bai asked in a strict tone. "It works well in combination with rhinofire blossoms when refined into a medicine, taking the yang and converting it to yin. It can be used to create a comprehensive poison-preventing liquid that's a major ingredient in grandization pills." The young woman almost sounded scared, and spoke in a rapid-fire manner that ended with her taking a long breath. Su Qing stood outside the tent, listening closely. Next came the young man, who spoke even more hesitantly than his counterpart. "Palebeck root, also known as, well, it's a rubber plant of the spurge family with pale roots. It's slightly astringent and bitter, and is native to, well anyway, it can calm the F5 yin organs and—" Toward the end, he trailed off, obviously having forgotten the information. Inside the tent, the young man looked extremely nervous and even glanced at the young woman, hoping she would help him out. She obviously knew the details but didn't say anything until the young man appeared to be on the verge of tears. Meanwhile, Grandmaster Bai, who was sitting in front of them, suddenly looked toward the outside of the tent. One of the guards looked at him meaningfully. Grandmaster Bai thought for a moment, then shook his head. Turning his attention back to the stammering young man, he snorted coldly. "Tonight you'll copy the classic of plants and vegetation 10 times in a row." The young man really did look like he was going to cry, but he didn't offer any retort. Instead, he hung his head despondently. After testing both of his apprentices, Grandmaster Bai proclaimed that he was about to begin his daily lecture. For some reason, his voice seemed louder and clearer than usual. The young man didn't notice, but the young woman did and seemed a bit curious. Blinking a few times, she looked to the side and saw the shadow of a scrawny figure standing outside, silhouetted by the morning sun. Outside the tent, Su Qing listened attentively to every word spoken by Grandmaster Bai. Fearful that he might forget something, he committed everything to heart. To him, knowledge was a priceless treasure that he had long hoped to acquire. Time slipped by. Grandmaster Bai lectured for longer than usual, perhaps twice as long. It was late in the morning by the time he finished, and there were scavengers now lined up outside seeking treatment. That was when Grandmaster Bai said, "Would the young man outside the tent please step inside for a moment?" Su Qing emerged from his daze in a start. Feeling a bit guilty all of a sudden, he took a deep breath, opened the tent flap and quietly stepped inside. Normally speaking, he wouldn't be so nervous. However, he'd originally come to ask some questions, only to end up eavesdropping outside the tent. In the scavenger base camp, many people would react negatively to such behavior. Seeing how nervous Su Qing was, Grandmaster Bai calmly said, "Can I help you?" Off to the side, the young woman looked curiously at Su Qing. She recognized him, and it only took a moment to recall that he had brought an unconscious old man to them on his back. "Well met, Grandmaster Bai," Su Qing said, inclining his head. Then, remembering how Sergeant Thunder had acted before, he clasped hands and bowed deeply. After a moment of hesitation, he said, "I wanted to know a bit more about lifespan flowers." And he took out the 5 white boluses he'd been given by Boneblade and placed them in front of Grandmaster Bai. Even one such pill was precious, but Su Qing felt that one wasn't enough to compensate for listening in on the class. In fact, 5 of them probably weren't enough, so he also took out 10 spirit coins and put them next to the pills. Only after this did he feel a bit more at ease. Grandmaster Bai gave him a long, close look, then turned to the girl. "Tingyu, you explain." The girl sat up straight, a solemn expression on her face as she said, "Lifespan flower, also known as life-extending flame and god spirit weed, is a mutated variety of a god-type vegetation known as a regeneration tree. There are actually 73 known mutations, but only the first type can be used in medicines. They grow randomly in forbidden regions, without any specific habitat pattern. They're extremely rare. They can be used to regrow severed limbs, reinvigorate life force, and treat any injury other than those to the mind. After finishing with the explanation, the girl pulled out a book, flipped through it, then held up a page with a picture on it. This is what it looks like. The picture depicted a flower that looked ordinary other than the sawtooth edge to its leaves. There was also a strange marking in the middle of the flower. Su-Ching looked closely at the picture, committed the details to memory, then bowed deeply to Grandmaster Bai and the girl. Finally, he turned to leave. Before he could walk off, Grandmaster Bai casually said, "It's the kind of plant that can be encountered by chance but never searched for and found. They usually grow in places where large mutant beasts can be found. Be careful." Su-Ching once again clasped hands and bowed, then raced back through the camp to his room. Once inside, he pulled out a blank bamboo slip and used his iron skewer to inscribe it with both the description provided by the girl and the image of the lifespan flower itself. After that, he went on to write down as much information as he could remember from what he'd heard in the lecture. After looking at the bamboo slip covered with text, he felt content and put it away as surely as if it were a precious treasure. "I hope I can go back again and hear more." He put some thought into a good way to return later and listen to more of Grandmaster Bai's lessons, then cleared his mind and started his cultivation routine. That night he waited in the courtyard for Sergeant Thunder to return, whereupon he mentioned that he was making a run into the Forbidden Region. Sergeant Thunder seemed like he wanted to say something in response, but chose not to. He just nodded and offered some suggestions based on his experience. At that moment, he seemed like an old grandfather offering advice to his grandson before sending him out into the world. In fact, he spent almost the whole night offering advice. Su-Ching committed everything to memory. Finally, Sergeant Thunder gave him an animal skin sack which contained some medicinal powder that Graceful Raptor had left behind. After making sure he knew how to use it, Su-Ching said his farewells and headed out. Speeding through the morning light, he arrived sometime later at the periphery of the Forbidden Region. When he stepped through the boundary, he felt himself cut off from the warmth of the sun. Icy coldness pierced him, and he narrowed his eyes and looked around vigilantly. Then he shot into the depths of the forest so quickly he left behind a string of afterimages. A moment later, there was no sign of him. This was his second time entering the Forbidden Region jungle, and he felt a lot more at ease this time. It was very different from his first time. That said, he was more cautious than ever, and as he moved, he kept an eye on the flowers and plants around him, hoping to spot a lifespan flower. Eventually, he reached the muddy marsh and remembered what Graceful Raptor had taught him there. After covering himself in mud, he continued on. Before long, the day had gone by. During the entire time, he never encountered the fog of confusion, and by being careful, he was able to go around any large mutant beasts. He eventually reached the spot where they'd fought the black-scaled wolves. Everything looked mostly the same. Even the defenses they'd erected were in place. However, the wolf corpses had already decomposed, leaving behind nothing but bones. He checked the bones for signs that the meat had been torn off of them by teeth, but found no such evidence. Apparently, they'd rotted naturally. He breathed a sigh of relief. If nothing else, it seemed to indicate there were no dangerous mutant beasts around. With that, he found a suitable place in the area to hunker down for the night. He settled on a hollow inside a huge tree. As darkness fell and he huddled in the tree, he looked ahead to the canyon with the seven-leaf clover, and beyond it, the temple complex. He had other goals on this journey other than simply looking for lifespan flowers. He also wanted to find one of those scar-removing crystals for the girl in the general store. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "I'll see what's out there." Su-Ching wasn't unfamiliar with nighttime in forbidden regions. Whether it was the city ruins or this jungle, it was roughly the same. He had lived for upwards of 2 weeks in the former and had spent a number of nights in the latter. As he huddled in the tree hollow, he kept his eyes half open as he quietly performed breathing exercises, absorbing the mutagen-heavy spirit power. Once the spirit power was inside him, he cleansed it with the sea and mountain incantation, allowing the pure spirit power to spread through his body, while the mutagen entered his shadow. He had already become used to the difference in cultivation that his shadow provided. He wasn't sure if it was because of his shadow or the general danger in the forbidden region, but regardless, he had no choice but to maintain a high level of concentration. And thanks to that concentration, his cultivation progressed rapidly. Right now, he wasn't far from the 4th level of the sea and mountain incantation. It's like a grindstone. He wasn't sure exactly how grindstones worked, but he remembered a blacksmith back in the slums talking about how you needed to work a knife against one to get it truly sharp. Right now, the dangerous forbidden region had become his personal grindstone. After working under the influence of that grindstone, Su Qing completed a full cycle of cultivation, then opened his eyes. Looking out of the tree and into the night, he heard mutant beasts roaring. It sounded like the howling of devils. A sinister coldness was ever present, seeping into everything, and even hidden in the tree, Su Qing was no exception. It was very cold. It reminded him of his time in the city ruins, and before long he also felt a similar sense of loneliness. That said, he was used to loneliness. After a short time, he closed his eyes again and started another session of cultivation. In that manner, time passed. He had selected a very safe place to settle down. However, about halfway through the night, in the middle of his cultivation, he heard footsteps outside. It sounded chaotic, like there were numerous people walking around outside. Su Qing looked suspiciously out of the tree, but other than the trees, there was nothing else outside in the darkness. His heart sank further as he realized that the mutant beasts outside had grown silent. That put him even more on the alert. He thought back to the singing and the footsteps from before. However, these footsteps seemed different. It doesn't sound like the singing. There's no song at all. Having come to this conclusion, he remained quietly in place, even masking his breathing. The footsteps grew clearer, and eventually it sounded like a group of people approaching. At the same time, a coldness arose, so intense that Su Qing worried it might freeze him where he hid. He wasn't unfamiliar with this type of coldness, whether it was the time he heard the singing, or occasions in the city ruins when the grooves came out. However, this seemed different than when he heard the singing. Back then, he felt like his soul was frozen, but right now, though it was uncomfortable, he could at least still move. This is something like the grooves in the city ruins. Having reached this determination, he gripped his iron skewer tightly and took a deep breath. Trying to stop his heart from pounding, he closed his eyes tightly. Don't look at them, don't touch them, don't get close to them. After he closed his eyes, the footsteps became more urgent and closer. It was like a host of people were milling about the tree. Su Qing was shaken, but he forced himself not to open his eyes and look at whatever was outside. Eventually, when the sun rose into the dome of heaven, the footsteps faded into the distance. It was daytime. However, Su Qing still didn't open his eyes. He waited for a moment before looking out of the tree hollow. To his shock, he found that the opening had been sealed over with ice. Seeing that sunlight shone through the ice onto his face, he exhaled a shaky breath, then clenched his hand into a fist and punched the ice, shattering it. Su Qing climbed out into the open and looked around. All the wolf bones he'd seen the night before were gone. In their place were a mass of footprints. Human footprints. There were so many that there had to have been hundreds of people in the area. Su Qing had never heard of a situation in which hundreds of people would enter a forbidden region together. And what was even more unusual was that they were actual footprints, not shoe prints. Eventually, he looked away from the footprints, feeling a new sense of understanding about the grooves in forbidden regions. Thankfully, it was now daylight, which meant there was less danger to deal with, and Su Qing wasn't about to give up on his search. He continued on. Several hours later, he reached the spot where he and Squad Thunderbolt had harvested 7-leaf clovers in the canyon. Just like before, the sunlight couldn't penetrate the leafy canopy of vines that stretched over it. The entire place was filled with a floral fragrance and seemed completely different from the dangerous world outside of it. It was almost like a paradise. Upon reaching the harvesting spot, Su Qing breathed a sigh of relief. Then he looked beyond it to the distant temple complex. He rested only a moment before retracting his gaze and continuing onward at top speed. The jungle past the canyon was even thicker, with less sunlight making its way through the canopy. But perhaps because the ancient temple complex still radiated a bit of its former might and glory, the area seemed less dangerous. The surrounding jungle also seemed a bit warmer. In fact, as Su Qing got closer to the complex, the jungle trees seemed more like ordinary trees from the outside world. They didn't seem twisted and dark. He even spotted some 7-leaf clover, which he harvested. Everything about this area was surprising, but he didn't let his guard down. Another 2 hours went by, and evening was about to fall. That was when Su Qing emerged from the jungle proper and saw the temple complex in front of him. There were still trees in the area, but not many. The sunlight that hit his eyes was dazzling, but he still saw the numerous temple structures. They were round, and all of them were dozens of meters tall. Most of the stone walls were crumbling and covered with moss, but a few of the buildings were relatively intact. The entire place contained an air of grandeur. Stepping inside, he heard the sound of gravel crunching beneath his feet, and for some reason, he felt like he was looking around at an immense kingdom. Everything was in ruins, but it all had an aspect of profound age to it. It almost seemed like the ruins were trying to explain their history to him. Walking a bit further in, he found himself in front of a crumbling statue. Most of the bottom of the statue had been crushed into rubble, but the head and shoulders were intact. Even still, the statue loomed 90 meters in the air. Back when it was whole, it must have been at least 600 meters tall. Standing in front of it, Su Qing felt minuscule. The wind sounded like a lonely flute that cut this area out of space and time. Whatever glory this place had once embodied, it was now a thing of the past. He looked at the statue for a long time. He thought back to the slums outside the city ruins and wondered what they would be like when people came back years later to explore them. Would those people be like him now, carefully entering the forbidden region and peering into the ancient past? After a while, Su Qing left the statue to look around the rest of the temple complex. However, he didn't find the special crystal Sergeant Thunder had mentioned. Before leaving, Sergeant Thunder had described it in full, which was how Su Qing knew it glowed with a seven-colored light. Apparently, they were natural objects that didn't conform to any specific pattern in terms of where they appeared. After a fruitless search, he was feeling a bit disappointed and headed to the top of one of the larger temples to look around. Behind him was the jungle of the forbidden region, which seemed to go on without end. After calculating the date, he realized that this was the 4th day since Boneblade had bought insurance from him. He hadn't noticed any fog in the jungle the day before, and it didn't seem like there was any today, so he wouldn't have to do any rescuing. On the other side of the temple complex were the true depths of the forbidden region. Looking up, he saw that there was still some daylight left. That meant there was some time to explore deeper into the forbidden region, then come back to the temple to rest. Having made his decision, he jumped off the temple and continued onward to explore. As soon as he was in the jungle again, his nerves felt stretched taut, and he put himself on full alert. After all, this place would be full of more hazards than the outside areas. In fact, only about an hour later, he was back in the temple, his expression grim and fearful. On the upside, his sack was absolutely full. He had barely gone 500 meters into the jungle before finding a large patch of 7-leaf clovers. Much to Su Qing's delight, it had obviously been a long time since anyone harvested from that location. As a result, the harvest would fetch quite a sum. However, as he began picking the clover, he sensed the surrounding mutagen getting stronger. If it wasn't for his shadow being able to absorb the mutagen, it would have been difficult to make much progress at all. And that was when, far off in the distance, he saw the same type of grewish jellyfish he'd seen before. Except it wasn't just one jellyfish, it was about 10. They were smaller, but at the same time, emanated an intense coldness. Most of them seemed to be hanging from trees asleep, but the mere sight of them caused Su Qing to creep away quietly. The further he got into the jungle, the more he got the sense he was being watched by countless avaricious eyes lurking in the depths of the jungle. It caused a prickling sensation on his neck and back. And that was only the outside part of the forbidden region depths. It defied imagination to think of what terrifying things might exist further in. Not daring to explore any further, he'd hurried back to the temple complex. It was only after reaching the complex that the prickling sensation on his back faded away. The complex itself was a border that marked the truly deep parts of the forbidden region. Su Qing took a deep breath and used the last bits of evening light to find one of the intact temples to hole up in for the night. Inside, he found a wall crevice into which he crawled. Sergeant Thunder had mentioned that this place was a safe place to find refuge. Su Qing looked around the temple. It was large, with an enormous statue, a divine likeness, bearing a saber. It stood in the position of honor, surrounded by other lifelike statues on the walls. However, all of them were eroding in the sands of time. That said, there weren't many mutant beast droppings or footprints. If there were none, or if there were many, that would be an abnormality, and he would have picked another location. As long as those signs were few, it meant this place was relatively safe. The temple complex was in the middle of the jungle, but was in something of a clearing, so it made sense that the surrounding mutant beasts wouldn't come in very often. Soon night fell. As the howl of beasts drifted in the night air, Su Qing started his breathing exercises. Time passed. As he had guessed would be the case, A few mutant beasts came into the temple complex, but those he did hear were far away. However, just like the night before, about halfway to morning, he heard the chaotic sound of Gruish footsteps. This time, they were just outside the temple. "They're back." He frowned, wondering why these footsteps had appeared twice, both near him. He felt very uneasy, but considering the previous experience, he decided the best thing was to keep his eyes closed. However, instead of the footsteps eventually going off into the distance, they seemed to grow more numerous. As they gathered, sinister coldness spread. It made it seem like a whole army of Grus was gathering to attack the temple. Su Qing's heart sank, and he gripped his iron skewer tightly as he thought of ways to escape if things got too dangerous. However, that was when the footsteps outside ceased, and everything became incomparably quiet. The silence didn't make Su Qing feel like he could breathe easily. It was like the quiet before a storm, and it caused the hair to stand on end. He felt convinced that the Grus were simply hesitating about whether to enter. And then, in complete silence, one of the Grus finally did walk into the temple. Su Qing could hear the footsteps on the stone floor tiles. His heart leapt into his throat. But then, a murmuring sound drifted through the temple, something that sounded incredibly holy. Streams of golden light seeped out of the walls, filling the temple with light and covering Su Qing. Now his closed eyes perceived not a world of pitch black but one of radiance. And the golden radiance grew so intense that his eyes hurt. Then, for the first time since encountering Grus, he opened his eyes. Deathblade's thoughts. Thanks SoClaxon12, Bulletstorm, and Taoist /EgoDeath for the reviews. You guys are awesome. The surgery went well and I'm all good. I'm still taking it easy today. That said, I might try to do a short live stream test on my YouTube channel later today. That's right, I do have a YouTube channel, although it's pretty much dead, and I haven't posted anything for a long time. I want to do a live stream event on 6/15 when this translation goes public, and I drop a ton of chapters all in one day. To make that happen, I need to do a test live stream ahead of time. So if you're interested, subscribe to my channel and keep an eye out for that live stream. If it does work well, then I hope to do that cool event on 6/15, talking about the translation, sharing some of my favorite comments from the time it was in the sneak peek section, and, who knows, maybe some other cool stuff. Su Qing saw bright, golden light. It came from the statues on the walls, as worn with time as they were. Every statue was a light source, filling the temple with incomparable radiance. However, the greatest source of light wasn't those smaller statues. Instead, it was the huge primary statue of the temple, the divine likeness whose hands held a huge stone saber. Shaken, Su Qing looked into the light at the temple and saw that, at the temple door was a figure surrounded by a dark fog. It wasn't possible to make out any distinguishing features, but the figure seemed vaguely human, and as the golden light shone on it, it rippled and distorted. Beyond it, outside the temple, was an even greater host of dark, shadowy forms. There had to be hundreds, and while some were vaguely human, others seemed bestial. They radiated an astonishing coldness that rushed like a wave to connect to the figure inside the temple. As for the shadowy figure inside the temple, as the golden light shone on it, it threw its head back and released a howl that could shake one's soul. However, it didn't take a single step further into the temple. It was as if it was now prohibited from doing so. Su Qing looked over at the saber-wielding statue and suddenly noticed how lifelike it looked. Then, to his astonishment, it stepped off of its pedestal and started walking, overflowing with profound dignity and holiness. Like a god from heaven descended into the mortal world, it strode toward the shadowy figure. It lifted the saber and swung it down. That saber move was simple and unrefined, yet it contained a Tao resonance that could shake heaven and earth. Su Qing didn't hear any sound, but his soul trembled as if it sensed mournful screaming emanating from the shadowy figure. The fog surrounding it evaporated, revealing a rotting body draped with tattered clothing. Visible now was an old man with eye sockets that were nothing but gaping holes. A moment later, his body collapsed, dissipating as surely as the fog that had surrounded him. The shadowy figures outside were also affected. The fog surrounding them began to fade, and because of the golden light, Su Qing was able to see some of them clearly. One was a recognizable face. It was Captain Bloodshadow. He was in the crowd, his gaunt face expressionless. As the golden light shone on him, it was like he became purified and then vanished. A few moments later, there was nothing out in the darkness of night. All of the shadowy figures had disappeared. The light in the temple faded, and the shocking statue turned around and walked back to its place. Eventually, it stopped glowing and once again turned into a statue, standing there, looking at the main door of the temple, waiting and guarding. Soon everything was back to normal. However, Su Qing still huddled in the stone crevice, panting, his eyes shining with disbelief. The obviously dead Captain Bloodshadow still existed. The obviously ordinary temple shone, with shocking golden light at night. The obviously unmoving statue became a godlike figure, whose single saber strike was boundlessly majestic. Before long the sun rose, and a new day began. It took a while for Su Qing to settle his thoughts, whereupon he crawled out from the stone crevice. He looked at the light outside, then the statues on the wall, and finally the large statue with the saber. He wasn't sure what exactly the statue was, and whether it was alive or dead. He had no idea how long ago it was when this temple had been in its heyday, or what it had been like back then. But the events of the previous night had left him shaken. That was especially true of the majestic energy that accompanied that saber strike. It had left a mark deep in his soul, ensuring that he would never forget it. What was more unimaginable was there was actually an area in this dangerous forbidden region that darkness could not encroach upon. Sergeant Thunder hadn't mentioned that to him, but then again, maybe the old sergeant didn't even know. For one thing, events such as last night's weren't exactly common. Furthermore, there weren't many people in the base camp who stayed for prolonged periods in this forbidden region. Therefore, even if such events did occur occasionally, few people would have been around to serve as witnesses. Any stories that people did tell would have eventually turned into nothing but legends. Taking a long look at the statue, Su Qing clasped his hands and bowed deeply. Then, after some more thought, he took a candle out of his sack, put it in front of the statue, and lit it. Finally, he offered another respectful bow and then left the temple. After emerging from the complex, he kept looking over his shoulder at it, hoping it would help him remember everything. And he couldn't stop thinking about that single saber strike. In fact, as he was traveling back through the jungle, he found himself lifting his hand overhead and imitating the movement. With every attempt to copy it, he felt like the move was more and more familiar. The cultivation of the sea and mountain incantation involved imitating the image of the goblin. But now, Su Qing was replacing the image of that goblin with the image of that single saber strike. As he did, his cultivation base shot past the breakthrough point, and he entered the fourth level of the sea and mountain incantation, all without Su Qing even noticing what was happening. Perhaps because of how he was imitating that saber strike, this breakthrough didn't just provide a boost to his power and speed. It also pushed him to a breakthrough in his psyche. As a result, Su Qing felt like he could think more clearly, and when he raised his hand overhead, it already seemed like it contained some of the fundamental nature of the saber strike. It filled him with delight. 2 days passed. Perhaps it was because he was in the periphery of the forbidden region, or perhaps it was the shocking event that had played out in the temple, but either way, he didn't run into any Gru footsteps. And the mutant beasts were few and far between. His cultivation base had reached a higher level, making it easier to keep himself safe, but he still was very careful and cautious. He hadn't found the lifespan flower or the scar-removing crystal, but he'd harvested a good amount of 7-leaf clovers, so as soon as he returned, he would sell them for a hefty sum of spirit coins. It was evening when he neared the edge of the jungle, and that was when he stopped walking and looked down at a plant near his feet. It looked similar to the lifespan flower, although based on what he remembered from the picture he'd seen, it was another kind of plant. However, after some thought, he looked around guiltily as a plan formed in his mind, then reached down and harvested the thing. Finally, he ran out of the jungle and into the base camp, shortly after sunset. It wasn't late at night, so the camp was bustling. That was especially true of the feather-covered tents, which seemed filled with the sound of playful banter and spirited panting. Su Qing ignored the sounds as he returned to the residence. As soon as he opened the courtyard door, he saw Sergeant Thunder walking out. The sergeant noticed how bedraggled Su Qing looked, but didn't say anything about it. Instead, he looked relieved. "You were gone a long time. I went to that temple complex." Moonlight mixed with the lamplight in the courtyard, allowing Su Qing to see Sergeant Thunder's bloodshot eyes and exhausted expression. He clearly hadn't been sleeping much. Was it because? When Su Qing put the pieces together, he felt warmth in his heart. "Temple complex," Sergeant Thunder said, sounding surprised. He really hadn't envisioned Su Qing going that far into the forbidden region. However, he didn't ask questions. Instead, he led Su Qing into the kitchen, rolled up his sleeves and put some food on the table. The food was hot and clearly hadn't been touched. Su Qing was taken aback. Obviously, Sergeant Thunder hadn't been sure when Su Qing would return, yet had hot food ready for him the moment he got back. It was very telling. The sergeant had been preparing food every night and waiting for him. Su Qing went to get the bowls and chopsticks. As usual, he set the table for 3, with 2 sets opposite of his own. Then he sat down to eat. It was delicious in a way that the taste buds might not be able to detect, but the heart could. Sergeant Thunder didn't eat much. For the most part, he drank and watched Su Qing, a smile on his face. "Eat up," he said at one point. "You're still growing. If you don't get enough food, you won't grow tall." Su Qing looked down for a moment, then cleared his throat and obediently started eating some more. Then he started telling Sergeant Thunder about everything that happened in the temple. Before, Sergeant Thunder had simply been sipping his alcohol, but after hearing the story, he took a deep breath and said, "I heard someone mention something like that before, but it was a long time ago. There may have been others who saw what you did, but like the singing, it eventually turns into a legend. Now that I think about it, the stories always talk about it happening after the singing." Sergeant Thunder suddenly seemed wrapped up in his thoughts, as if he were recalling old sorrows. Su Qing could guess what he was thinking and felt that he was to blame. He probably shouldn't have told the story. Shortly thereafter, Sergeant Thunder regained his composure. Seeing Su Qing looking glum, he smiled. "You're too sensitive, kid. I'm not as weak as you think I am." He took another sip of alcohol, then changed the subject, going on to tell Su Qing some funny stories about things that happened in the camp while he was gone. Sergeant Thunder drank and talked. Su Qing ate and listened. It really did seem like the two of them were family. Later that night, the sergeant was still drinking as Su Qing cleaned up. Finally, the old man smiled, got up, and went into his room. Su Qing went to his own room and saw that the bedding had been changed, and instead of being rolled up at the bottom like he usually kept it, it was spread out over the bed. It also smelled like it had been aired out in the sun recently. He was about to sit down when he looked down at his clothes and hands and saw how dirty they were. Rolling the bedding back up, he sat on the wooden slats to work on his cultivation. At dawn, Su Qing opened his eyes. He was about to leave when a thought occurred to him. Going into the washroom, he washed his hands. Given how unused he was to such a thing, it took some effort. After his hands were clean and sparkling, he left the courtyard and headed toward the caravan. He wasn't sure if he was going too early, but he really didn't want to arrive too late. If he arrived early, Grandmaster Bai might not have begun the lecture, but if he arrived late, then he would miss out on the first part of the class. Calculating the time on his fingers, he arrived at Grandmaster Bai's tent. As it turned out, he was just in time to hear the testing. Feeling very excited, he stood outside the tent and listened carefully. Blue lotus flower syrup, also known as blue lotus syrup, is derived from the flowering buds of water lilies. It is an aromatic liquid created by a unique heating technique. It can stabilize the lungs, help control bloody coughing from fire-related techniques. It was the voice of the young woman. Su Qing listened intently, hardly aware of the passage of time. Before he knew it, 2 hours had gone by. Suddenly, the tent opened, and Grandmaster Bai was standing there looking at him. "Can I help you?" Grandmaster Bai's gaze wasn't sharp, but it was imposing. Su Qing instantly felt nervous. Quickly reaching into his sack, he pulled out the medicinal plant he'd harvested the day before. Keeping his head bowed, he said, "Grandmaster Bai, I wanted to ask whether or not this is a lifespan flower." In response to his words, Grandmaster Bai stared at him blankly for a moment. Then an unusual expression flitted over his face. He looked at Su Qing's hands, which seemed a lot cleaner than before, and then at Su Qing's face, which was taut with. "It's not," he said. Su Qing quickly clasped hands, then hurried away, breathing a sigh of relief as he left the caravan area. Then he looked back and realized Grandmaster Bai was still looking at him. The old man nodded. Su Qing stopped walking, then clasped hands and bowed deeply before continuing on his way. After Su Qing disappeared, Grandmaster Bai went back into the tent. Inside, the guards, as well as his 2 apprentices, remained in place, motionless as if they were made in stone. Right in front of his seat, there was now a table spread with a variety of fine food and drink. On the opposite side of the table from Grandmaster Bai's seat was an old man in a violet robe, behind whom stood a servant in a gray garment. Looking at Grandmaster Bai, the old man in violet laughed heartily. "Well, what do you think, Grandmaster Bai?" Grandmaster Bai didn't seem at all surprised at the sudden arrival of this old man in violet, nor was he worried that his people in the tent were frozen in place. Sitting down in his chair, he lifted one of the flagons of alcohol and took a drink. "What do you mean? What do I think?" The violet-robed old man smiled. "I'm talking about the kid. Like I said last time, while I was waiting for you to show up earlier, I found a boy with lots of potential." Grandmaster Bai gave a cold harumph and glared at the violet-robed man. Potential. The first time the child eavesdropped, it wasn't a big deal. But this time he pulled out some medicinal plant and asked me if it was a lifespan flower. Now I'm getting the feeling he's going to start bringing all sorts of random plants here as an excuse to eavesdrop. If not for your recommendation, I would have driven him away immediately. The man in violet laughed again. "You have a mouth like a blade but a heart like tofu. Given your foul temper, if you didn't think he has some potential, it wouldn't matter who introduced him to you, you wouldn't give him the time of day." Grandmaster Bai gave another cold snort, and instead of offering a further explanation, asked, "You want to take him to Seven Blood Eyes, don't you? Taking him to that pestilent place would be a waste of a potential academic." Eyebrows twitching, the man in violet said, "Waste? I think not. Besides, what good is it to be an academic? In this world, everything is about your cultivation base." "What good is it to be an academic?" Grandmaster Bai retorted heatedly. "Let me ask you, why did you come here and repeatedly beg me, an ordinary person, to go with you to Seven Blood Eyes?" With an embarrassed smile, the man in violet said, "Oh, well, you're different, sir." "How am I different?" Grandmaster Bai snapped, glaring. The man in violet suddenly smacked his own forehead. "Aya, I completely forgot that I have something really important to do right now. I need to leave, Grandmaster Bai. I'll come back tomorrow and we can drink some more together." He got up and prepared to leave, but at the last moment looked back at Grandmaster Bai. When he spoke, his tone was very earnest. "Grandmaster Bai, if you really think the boy has potential, then teach him some more. Give him a chance. Maybe he can get to Seven Blood Eyes as an academic with a cultivation base." With that, he left with his servant. After he was gone, everything in the tent returned to normal, with no one having any idea something strange had just taken place. The guard stood there. The young man was muttering anxiously, and the young girl looked pleased with herself like usual. As for Grandmaster Bai, he sat there looking thoughtfully at the spot where Su Qing had disappeared. Deathblade's thoughts. Hey all, after a successful livestream test earlier today, I'm officially announcing that I'm going to do a celebratory livestream on Thursday 6/15 to go along with the public launch of this novel and a big mass release of chapters. Among other things, I'm going to be sharing some of my favorite comments from when the novel was in sneak peek. That includes this chapter and everything up to the chapters on Wednesday. There is still a chance to get some good comments into the mix. After reaching his residence, Su Qing let loose a long sigh. He was worried he hadn't done the right thing in eavesdropping. However, it was as though he had any other options if he wanted to sate his thirst for knowledge. One thing was obvious. Grandmaster Bai had seen through his little scheme. "I should offer a payment." The only question was what to offer and whether it would be accepted. If not, would he ever get another chance like this again? Worried that he might forget about this new idea, he took a bamboo slip out of his sack and used the iron skewer to carve Grandmaster Bai on it. After finishing, he looked it over, then added 4 more names. One was Sergeant Thunder, and the other 3 were people who had helped him back in the slums. Though that help had been minor, he wanted to remember it. After finishing with the names, he took out another bamboo slip and started recording the contents of the lecture. Then he took out the slip with the first lesson's information and reviewed it all. Only then did a look of satisfaction appear on his face. "I already know the details of 27 types of medicinal plants." Su Qing was in a good mood, and it lasted all day, even through his daily cultivation routine. The next day he got out of bed early and went out to buy some 7-leaf clovers. He also bought another plant that looked similar to a lifespan flower, then followed what was now becoming a routine as he went to Grandmaster Bai's tent. He stood in the same spot as the day before, and just like the day before, he listened carefully to the entire lesson. Also similar to the previous day, Grandmaster Bai came out and asked what he was doing there. Su Qing meekly held up the flower and asked the same question as the day before. Grandmaster Bai looked at the flower and sighed. Shaking his head, he told Su Qing all the information about the plant he'd bought. Of course, that gave Su Qing details about yet another medicinal plant. Feeling very pleased and also deeply thankful, he bowed deeply, then hurried away. Just like before, he looked over his shoulder to see Grandmaster Bai watching him. Yet again, they shared a nod. Su Qing was building memories he would never forget. In this manner, half a month passed. Every day, Su Qing would go to Grandmaster Bai's tent with a medicinal plant in hand. He would listen to the lecture, then ask about the plant. As a result, he learned a lot about plants and vegetation, and in addition, learned about how different plants worked in combination. He benefited immensely, and now had dozens of bamboo slips filled with information. Grandmaster Bai never mentioned anything about his eavesdropping, and always patiently explained the details of the plants Su Qing brought with him. Eventually, the guards got used to seeing the kid in the fur overcoat showing up early in the caravan area, and Grandmaster Bai's two young apprentices were the same. In fact, once when it was raining heavily, Grandmaster Bai and both of his apprentices assumed Su Qing wouldn't come, only to have him show up in a woven rush raincoat. Neither wind nor rain could stop him. The two apprentices were deeply impressed by that. As a result, when one day came in which Su Qing uncharacteristically didn't show up, both young apprentices were craning their necks to look outside. They were actually surprised that the dirty little scavenger hadn't come. But they didn't end up disappointed, as Su Qing eventually did show up, exhausted. The reason he was late on that day was that, in addition to attending lectures at Grandmaster Bai's tent, he also took time to go into the Forbidden Region and look for lifespan flowers and scar-removing crystals. Further, he honed his skills by hunting mutant beasts. None of his efforts that day had gone smoothly. He had not found either of the two items he was looking for, and ended up having difficulty with some of the dangers in the Forbidden Region. Despite being in the 4th level of the sea and mountain incantation, and having the acute judgment and powers of observation normally reserved for long-time scavengers, not even he could avoid every dangerous thing in the Forbidden Region's periphery. The day he was late, he ran into a mutant beast that had wandered out from the depths, and he barely made it out of the encounter alive. Only by running through the night did he manage to make it back to the base camp by morning. He hadn't even rested, and had instead gone straight to the lecture. That said, he had made some financial gains in recent days, specifically by selling more insurance to Boneblade. Boneblade was doing very well. After the first instance in which he bought insurance, he made it a habit. So far, he had never encountered the fog of confusion again, and thus Su Qing had never needed to rescue him, but Boneblade seemed determined to keep it up. And because of that, others in the camp started to do the same thing. For the sake of caution, Su Qing refused most offers, with the exception of the small group he had saved in the past. However, he still had a steady stream of profit, and thanks to earnings made from his forays into the Forbidden Region, life was good. Sergeant Thunder couldn't go on missions anymore, so Su Qing offered to pay more rent. Sergeant Thunder refused, but Su Qing insisted, and after going back and forth about it, the sergeant realized he had no choice but to accept. He spent most of the money on food, and thus, whenever Su Qing came back from the Forbidden Region, there was always a hot meal waiting for him. Sergeant Thunder even bought Su Qing some new clothes. They were so splendid that Su Qing couldn't bear to put them on. He just folded them up carefully and put them in the cupboard. Occasionally, he would bring them out and look at them contentedly. Su Qing's favorite time of day was dinner time. Not only was the food delicious, but also Sergeant Thunder was always there with him. The sergeant seemed like a grandfather in retirement, always ready to share the latest gossip about the neighbors and explain the latest news of camp matters. Crucifix and Graceful Raptor would return every once in a while, and they would join dinner before heading out on more missions. Su Qing felt happier than he had in the past 6 years. He had food to eat, clothes to wear, and Sergeant Thunder to keep him company. His cultivation base continued to improve, and his knowledge of plants and vegetation grew constantly. He cherished everything, and of course, whenever he listened to the lectures outside the tents, he paid very close attention. It was on one bright morning that, as he stood outside the tent, he heard Grandmaster Bai testing his apprentices. Chen Feiyuan, tell me about Night Corp's morning glory. Over the course of the last month or so, Su Qing had learned that Grandmaster Bai's male apprentice was named Chen Feiyuan, while the female apprentice was Tingyu. Upon hearing the question, Chen Feiyuan stammered some nonsense before finally closing his mouth. Su Qing couldn't see inside the tent, but occasionally when he'd been able to peep in through the flap, he'd seen Chen Feiyuan looking very despondent. You ignoramus, Grandmaster Bai said harshly. Tingyu, you answer. Unfortunately, Tingyu wasn't as prepared as she usually was. Night Corp's morning glory, also known as poisonous mountain root model, teacher, I forgot. She trailed off into silence. The tent was very quiet, apparently as Grandmaster Bai sat there with his fury simmering. Finally, he spoke, and he did nothing to hide the anger in his trembling voice. "Kid, you answer." Outside the tent, Su Qing's eyes went wide for a moment, and then he started talking without even thinking about it. Nightcorp's morning glory, also known as poisonous mountain root mottle, refers to the stalk and root of feverfew vein turtle-dove chrysanthemums. It is a woody vine-type plant found in ravines of the Corpse Mountains, usually in chilly streams or jungle thickets. It's astringent but feels warm in the mouth. It also imparts a sensation of decay. It's particularly useful in protecting against drafts and inducing perspiration. That said, it's extremely poisonous and is a typical example of the polarity of yin and yang in medicinal plants. With that, Su Qing closed his mouth. Inside the tent, the two young apprentices seemed slightly upset at having been outshone, so Grandmaster Bai asked, "What are the symptoms of overdose?" Su Qing felt extremely nervous, but without hesitation he answered, "Symptoms include stomach pain, dizziness, and hallucinations. If you don't start counteracting the poison within 15 minutes, the result is death." How do you counteract the poison? You begin by inducing vomiting and pumping the stomach. Then you use a combination of egg whites and redthorn stamens, treating the symptoms at noon when the sun is bright. The treatment time should last for no more than an hour and should continue for 3 days. During Su Qing's explanation, Grandmaster Bai sat in the tent, his face completely expressionless. As for the two apprentices, they stared with wide-eyed shock. "Why is it a good example of the polarity of yin and yang?" Grandmaster Bai asked. The polarity of yin and yang is expressed perfectly in the opposition between vitality and unhealthiness. Vital yang represents beneficial medicine. Yin unhealthiness represents dangerous poisons. Su Qing's answer came without even thinking. He had learned this information recently and had recited the details numerous times until he remembered every bit perfectly. "What can you do with this plant?" Grandmaster Bai asked. "You could take Nightcorp's morning glory and combine it with mindset leaf, which would double its yang efficacy. That would help treat damage to the soul and also relieve some of the effects of mutagen. However, if you combine it with downy orchid, it would increase its yin efficacy. In fact, it would become so poisonous that, if an ordinary person consumed it, they would die within 30 breaths of time." "How do you deal with downy orchids? What are the uses of mindset leaf roots? How can you?" Grandmaster Bai asked more questions in a rapid-fire manner, making Su Qing even more nervous. However, he responded in kind. For the time it takes an incense stick to burn, an old man and a young man went through an intensive question-and-answer session. The questions Grandmaster Bai asked were all related to the content of the lectures in recent days. Thus, Su Qing knew all the answers and was able to provide them quickly. The two apprentices went from being shocked to looking shaken, and stared blankly at Su Qing's shadow silhouetted on the tent. Finally, Grandmaster Bai asked the concluding question. "Take 3 one-year-old Nightcorp's morning glories, combine them with 6 3-year-old cloud-pessing tufts, add in 9 10-year-old short-leaved killingas, and create a medicinal liquid. What does it do?" Both of the young apprentices' faces fell. This question was not about a simple description of plants, but rather a complicated mixture. It was also the first question that Su Qing couldn't answer immediately. After thinking for more than 30 breaths of time, he took a deep breath and said, "Unhealthiness is difficult to suppress. Yang exhilarates, yin debilitates. Bringing in the cloud-pessing tufts, yang efficacy raises the short-leaved killingas, detoxifying properties to an astounding level." After finishing speaking, Su Qing stood there with his eyes wide, as if he had just realized something. "And that," Grandmaster Bai said coolly, "is 70% of the pill formula for a basic grandization pill. Combine those 3 medicinal plants, heat them for 14 hours, and you'll have the pill. I asked you a lot of questions. Now, do you have anything you want to ask of me?" Su Qing felt shaken. Over the past month or more, he had plenty of unanswered questions. After all, he had been eavesdropping. And though Grandmaster Bai hadn't prevented him from doing so, there was no way he could ever bring himself to interrupt the lecture with questions. But now that Grandmaster Bai had given him the opportunity, he didn't hesitate. "Grandmaster Bai, do flame rope hemp and yangseed needles work well no matter where they grow? I know they're similar, but how exactly do they differ? Why can't you pick coffin-resting buds during the daytime? The sap of mindset leaves obviously drives out unhealthiness, but why can't they be used together with life-site branches, which also drive out unhealthiness?" Su Qing asked question after question, and Grandmaster Bai answered them all in detail. It seemed as though there would be no end to Su Qing's questions. Time passed until it was far past when the lecture would usually end. From the expressions on the faces of the two apprentices, it was as if they were witnessing a freak of nature. Finally, Su Qing looked up at the sun and, seeing how late it was, stopped asking questions. As far as he was concerned, it was impossible to describe how much he had benefited this day. Many of his questions had been answered, and more than ever, he felt like he was gaining comprehensive understanding of the topic, and it only made his thirst for knowledge grow even more intense. As he was preparing to leave, Grandmaster Bai said one more thing from inside the tent. From now on, don't stand outside the tent, and don't bring those random medicinal plants either. Henceforth, you'll be attending class inside.